Hi there. Good morning. Thank you for being here. Right. Deep breath. Firstly, are you okay? Oh, I'm sorry. I've got completely the wrong script for this morning's programme. We're turning our attention first this morning to the vexed question of why this COVID inquiry continues to bubble under. It's due to open this morning. I'm not sure yet whether we're going to be able to take Baroness Hallett's comments live on the programme. I'd like to, but you know when I'm at my weakest, or at least at my, what's the word I'm looking for? My least confident. It's quite bizarre because sometimes when the bulk of the media are ignoring something that I think is really important, I derive enormous strength from it. And listen, I'm going to be soppy for a minute. I derive enormous strength from how much I know it means to you. And we're getting cross about things that don't involve refugees, for example, and do involve PPE contracts. When you find yourself getting more exercised by the fact that you're being lied to by the people in charge and of course their client journalists all over the broadcast and print media, you're getting more angry about that, even though the bulk of the broadcast and print media is pointing at dead cats and desperately trying to get you cross about bloody e-scooters or something. I think it's so hard to keep track. But there are days when I wonder whether I'm getting it wrong. And I often, well, not often, but I sometimes do. I sometimes think, well, that's a really big story that's being woefully ignored by the mainstream media. I hate that phrase. And I don't know whether this is one of them. I genuinely don't. I don't think it can be. There must be huge levels of interest in the COVID-19 inquiry that is due to kick off today. Hopefully we'll listen to Baroness Hallett's opening comments, but you know how technology is. We're not 100% sure that we'll be able to yet. It's really, really, really important. I can't believe I have to say that. But when you look around for cover, I'll give you another example, right? A really good example. Do you remember Sue Gray? Sue Gray is a wonderful example of everything that's wrong with the media in this country, because Sue Gray did a report into the Downing Street parties that the right-wing media claimed was a almost complete exoneration of Boris Johnson. And do you know who else claimed it was an almost complete exoneration of Boris Johnson? Boris Johnson. The words damp squib, I think, appeared on the front page of two newspapers, definitely one. Damp squib, the idea that everyone was expecting this report to be explosive, and it was nothing of the sort, and Johnson was able to survive, hang on to his job. Lots of people twaddled about cake. The Chancellor of the Exchequer, the Prime Minister, the Prime Minister's wife, all got fined by the Metropolitan Police, but nothing to see here. Everybody move on. Within about a month, she was being pilloried as the architect of Boris Johnson's downfall. I sometimes marvel at the blatant nature of the deceptions visited upon the people of this country by the institutions and organisations and individuals that they turn to with a sense of trust, looking for the information that is important. Within weeks of the so-called damp squib, Boris Johnson had been hounded out of office as a consequence of his lies about the promotion of a well-known sex pest to the office of Deputy Chief Whip. And all of his cheerleaders and client journalists started claiming that it was the Sue Gray report that had somehow holed him below the waterline. So it had gone from damp squib to career-ending explosion in the space of 6 or 7 weeks. And I am today cross also with people who lap it up. The contempt for the con man, compassion for the con mantra can only go so far, because some people are lapping it up. Some people who were jumping up and down about the Sue Gray report being a damp squib were weeks later jumping up and down about Sue Gray's appointment to a job in Keir Starmer's Labour Party being proof that the damp squib was actually a conspiracy. How can it be a damp squib and a witch hunt? How can it be a damp squib and a conspiracy? How can it exonerate him and damn him at the same time? The answer, of course, lies in the character of a man who wrote 2 columns, one in support of Brexit and one against it, the night before deciding which one to publish. So just a little, what's the word there? There's a little indication there of how mad things really are. And then think of Daily Mail front pages about the best Tory budget that we've ever seen. Finally, a true Tory budget. The one from Liz Truss and Kwasi Kwarteng. The steel of the new Iron Lady about Theresa May. The speed with which they move from a position of absolute certainty, injected, bang, smack into the veins of their readers. And then weeks later, they're peddling the precise opposite position. The precise opposite position, not a wobble, not a wibble, but the absolute polar opposite of what they were punting to their readers and listeners and viewers just just a few weeks before. So Sue Gray won't get mentioned by all the people that were trying to turn it into a bonfire a few weeks ago. And it happened from both extremes. There were ludicrous, forelock-tugging client Tory journalists, and there were Corbyn cultists all claiming that this was evidence of something corrupt or something dodgy. Looks like Akoba, the relevant watchdog, are going to wave it through 6 months gardening leave, which would be normal for anybody leaving the civil service, and she'll be imposed by autumn. Anyone reading that story, following events honestly, would have expected that to happen. Some of us, many of us said so, but it doesn't matter. So all of the Sue Gray coverage of a couple of months ago, all of the people who indulged in it, who engaged in it, who published it, who broadcast it, where are they? What are they going to do with this story now? You'll have to wait and see. Speaking of Liz Truss and Kwasi Kwarteng, front page of yesterday's Daily Telegraph claimed that Johns Hopkins University in America had conducted research into the efficacy or the success of COVID lockdowns. Unfortunately, that wasn't actually true. Essentially, not least because the Vice Dean of Johns Hopkins University came out and said, his name is Dr. Joshua Sharfstein, he came out and said that the scientific study concerned, well, it was not a peer-reviewed scientific study. He sought to distance the university from the work and said that serious questions had been raised about its methodology. This is because the researchers were economists, not epidemiologists. You may have heard about this story. It was on the front page of the Daily Telegraph. They weren't epidemiologists. They weren't public health experts. They were economists. One of them working for the libertarian think tank, the Cato Institute, another one working for the Centre for Political Studies in Copenhagen, and another Swedish emeritus professor, not of public health or epidemiology or immunology or virology, but of economics. And it was ancient. It was over a year old. It had already been debunked. But an organisation called the Institute of Economic Affairs has put a revised version of the original report into a new book. And that ends up on the front page of the Daily Telegraph. And some people present it. In fact, often the very same people who were pretending that the Sue Gray story was somehow scandalous are offering up the so-called study by a bunch of economists linked to libertarian or right-wing think tanks as evidence that lockdowns didn't work. You've got a Daily Mail columnist today claiming it vindicates him, which is beyond comical until you remember that these are the same people who were pretending that the Sue Gray story was somehow scandalous. So just have a look. So just pause for a minute. Think about those three points of that triangle. Front page stories trying to debunk lockdowns already. Government trying to prevent inquiry from being able to do its job properly by demanding that they have the right to decide what evidence is relevant as opposed to the actual judge. And then inquiry getting underway today with warnings that the chair may be forced to quit if messages are not redacted. That's from a lawyer representing the COVID-19 bereaved families. It is not something upon which Heather Hallett has herself commented, but if she doesn't get the evidence that she has demanded and described as necessary, then, in the words of that lawyer, the only logical response of the chair is to resign because she can't properly do her job. How obvious does it have to be that this lot do not want the truth to come out? That the combination of right-wing government and right-wing media do not want the inquiry to be conducted. They don't want us to see the messages coming in from newspaper owners saying, please don't lock down because our sales have gone through the floor. They were getting financial help from the government. You weren't. Oh, you were if you were furloughed. Private schools were getting loans from the government while state schools couldn't. I mean, the morass that is going to come out if this inquiry is conducted properly is absolutely epic. But front page stories today in the right-wing media are looking at PM set to overrule the Lords on the boats bill. Even, I'm afraid the Times has done some brilliant work in this field and continues to do so. But if the flags go up, then conversations between Rupert Murdoch's representatives on Earth and Boris Johnson's government at the time will become, I think, embarrassing for them. You've got the newspaper, which swims almost alone these days, picking up on the fury of COVID families as the inquiry into NHS failures is set to be delayed until after the next general election. That's the chronological order of the inquiry. Express does Sunak's bidding by talking about barges. The Sun's talking about Taylor Swift's love life. And on it goes. Nothing really, nothing big really from any of the newspapers that are constantly exhorting you to get cross and frightened about refugees or Sue Gray or whoever else it is this week, eco-protesters, about the fact that this inquiry, it seems to me, is already under siege from both the think tanks, the media and the Tories. I mean, why don't people care more? 0345 6060 973. That's a slightly rhetorical question. I'm not expecting that to ignite the switchboard. But what I do want to do, as this inquiry gets underway, I want you to, and I possibly should have come at it from this angle before, I want you to tell me why it matters to you. Because an awful lot of people are going to spend an awful lot of time and energy and an awful lot of money in the coming months trying to persuade the population that nobody really cares about it. They did the same with Leveson, and for decades they did the same with Hillsborough. Hillsborough, which traces much of its horror for the families of the dead back to the single most despicable front page in the history of British journalism. They try to cover this stuff up. Bernard Ingham was Margaret Thatcher's press secretary at the time of Hillsborough, and he went to his grave refusing to apologise for his role in the calumnies and slanders that were visited upon the families, the survivors, and the families of the dead by the Sun newspaper and other corners of the media, although it was the Sun that constantly and repeatedly refused to apologise for its obnoxious, its hideous so-called journalism. So that I don't think they will want the truth to come out. I really don't. And I know that sounds a bit tinfoil hat, but, you know, look at Daniel Morgan. Look at Hillsborough. Look at Bloody Sunday. Look at the attempts by the, I'm going to say the establishment. Look at the attempts to keep the lid upon scandalous conduct by governments. In the case of all of those examples, conservative governments. But I wouldn't for a moment suggest that they would have a monopoly on this sort of cover-up. The Iraq War is something that many of us feel could have done with a heck of a lot more transparency and a heck of a lot more accountability a heck of a lot sooner. So I am probably going to be, that was it. The Daily Mail's front page after Sue Gray came out was, is that it? ? They went even further than damp squib. Is that it? So I think what we need to do today is get ready for what is coming. Because if the Telegraph can stick that on that front page, in full knowledge that it's a load of old toot, then the attempts to debunk or undermine any inquiry are going to be weapons grade. They're going to be nuclear. The government is trying to determine what evidence is relevant to the inquiry that they called. I like these introductions sometimes because I start off thinking, am I losing it a bit? Am I the only one who thinks this is important? I get to the end of my introduction, I think, no, mate, you're all right. You're all right for another day. This is blimmin' important, and it's absolutely scandalous that every single voice, every single platform, every single organ in the country isn't screaming from the rooftops about the fundamental absurdity of a government seeking to determine what evidence is relevant to an independent inquiry that they called, all the way to the High Court. Rishi Sunak going to the High Court in an attempt to keep evidence away from Baroness Hallett. These are strange, strange times indeed. So, let's bring it back to basics then, together today. I want you to tell me, and you don't have to have a tale of grief or bereavement, of long-term illness or of horrible personal experience. I don't, as it happens. The closest we came to avoidable trauma during lockdown was the funeral of a very, very close friend who died of a condition that he would have died of anyway. It was only the circumstances of the funeral that were defined by COVID, and almost all of the most reliable epidemiological evidence shows that short, sharp, very quickly introduced lockdowns were the way to deal with this virus, unless you had a population and a geographical scenario like Sweden's, where you could rely upon a population to voluntarily do everything that needed to be done, and with the wherewithal to keep significant amount of distance between the population, something we didn't have in this country. We still don't have in this country. So why does it matter to you? That's the only question, really, that resonates this morning. Why does it matter to you? Why do you need the COVID-19 inquiry to go on? What do you need to know? That's my question for you this morning. What do you need to know? 0345 6060 973. Don't be shy. It may not sound as serious or as profound as some of the things that other people need to know, but it's your right to know. What do you need to know? And hope that the COVID inquiry will reveal or discover. 0345 6060 973. And if you hit the numbers now, you will get through. 22 minutes after 10 is the time. Celia says, I need to know why he didn't go to the government Cobra meetings. I need it because two of my friends had their lives decimated. I need to know that if something like COVID happens again, the government of the day, regardless of the party, have been able to profit from the lessons learned and have the systems in place to act quicker and more efficiently. Public health is the priority. So Boris Johnson axed the body that was preparing for precisely the sort of pandemic that we faced approximately 6 months before the stories started coming through from China and then shortly afterwards Italy. These are the things that you need to know on a meta level, if you like, as opposed to a personal level. But I'm interested in both the meta and the micro, the personal and the political. As my slightly conspiracy theory flavoured fears grow that the usual suspects are already attempting to poo-poo both the inquiry and its conclusions, let alone scupper its investigatory powers. The actual Prime Minister is already doing that in plain sight in the High Court. I want to know what you need to know. John's in Croydon. John, what would you like to say?
Good morning, James. I believe we have to follow the money, James, because I think in the time of the pandemic, we all agreed that it should be rushed out the door for the benefit of us and to make sure that we had the protection in place, whether that was PPE, extra hospitals, track and trace apps. And I mean, I forget the number off the top of my head, but wasn't it something like 30 billion on a track and trace
37 billion.
Yeah,
I think that's a sort of not a ballpark. That's a parachute figure. I think it covers more than just the app that was on our phones, and some of it would not be considered to have been wasted. But it's an eye-watering sum of money that just got sort of bandied about, and then Dido Harding went from hero to zero in about 10 seconds flat, and now never gets talked about at all. It's bizarre, isn't it, considering that they got all the big calls right?
So there's talk of things that just simply didn't pan out well and so on. There's talk of fraud. There's talk of somebody owning a boat called Lady M. I mean, if you go into it, I know there's conspiracy. So I don't want to get too involved.
No, I shouldn't have used that phrase because I don't think it's helpful. You're referring to Michelle Mone, who's in the news again today with reports that one of the certificates that were provided to prove that the company she was involved with was able to provide PPE is being called into question. I'm speaking in terms because it's an FT piece and I haven't got it exactly in front of me, but there are all sorts. I don't know how confident we can be that they're going to look at that side of things. I don't know for sure what their remit is, but you prioritise that over the more obvious questions about whether people died unnecessarily.
Do you know what it is for me, James? Is I believe that side of things will be covered, and I think that side of things we'll have a look into. And also, I wouldn't be so reliant on the government inquiry for my own knowledge, because what I would say is that there will be a lot of epidemiologists, a lot of virologists, a lot of people that you before mentioned, that they were able to provide you with the answers, and I'd probably have more trust in them than I would have.
It's not a government inquiry. It's really important to remember that. It's an independent inquiry, and the fact that the government is already going to the High Court to try and keep evidence away from the independent inquiry should give you faith in Baroness Hallett's probity and in the ambition and the intent of the inquiry. But there is an astonishing, when you think about when you think about how corners of the media deal with the cost of, for example, of an environmental protest, for example, and pretend to be absolutely outraged and disgusted and infuriated by that, the sums of money that may have been misappropriated or at the very least misspent during COVID, I think in a normal country, in a vaguely normal country, would be beyond national scandal status and probably be into imprisonment territory. But what's the likelihood of that happening here? That is, of course, the second part of my inquiry this morning. What do you need to know? And how likely do you think it is that this inquiry will reach parts that other inquiries have failed to reach? 0345 6060 973. Naz is in Enfield. Naz, what do you need to know?
I need to know the truth without any cover-up, because I lost my father. I lost my father-in-law at the time when there were parties when he had COVID. He was sent. He was ill. He went to hospital for pneumonia. He was better. They sent him back to the care home, which was supposed to be ring-fenced by Matt Hancock, and he died. And people weren't allowed to go and see him. You had to look by a glass window outside. And I lost my father when there were only 10 people allowed to attend the funeral. So I feel very betrayed by all of them.
But I completely understand, and I'm not badgering the witness, but what do you need to know? What are the questions relevant to these experiences that you need answers to? Do you see what I mean?
Yes. I need them to say exactly what happened.
Yeah.
So tell me that So why did you do this? Why did you lie to us? Why didn't you tell us the truth and trust us with the truth? Why aren't you honest enough to admit that you were wrong? All these things like the betrayal. I need the inquiry to turn up. I need it to be all published so I can read it word for word.
Yeah, and there'll be many, many, many people in your position. How confident are you that you'll get what you need, that you'll get what you want?
Well, every time it seems to go wrong. It's always a government. I don't know how a government can be allowed to take the question, to the High Court. Why are they doing this? Surely.
Why do you think they're doing it? I've asked this question on 2 or 3 separate occasions, and we haven't got a definitive answer. We never will. But why do you think they want to decide what evidence the inquiry gets to look at, rather than the inquiry?
Because they're lying, and they know that it will uncover all their lies.
But there's no other explanation, is there? There is embarrassing stuff there, and even if it's not relevant to the inquiry, and they're just worried that it will be leaked, it's still embarrassing to the degree that they're prepared to go to the High Court to try to keep it under lock and key.
Yeah, but that's what it's showing everybody, all victims, all people that have done the right thing. That's what it's showing. If they just let it carry on without bringing it to the High Court, people might have trusted them
so
a bit
much,
more.
isn't there? Yeah, you're so right. People might have trusted. Well, we did trust them. Those of us who observed the lockdowns, those of us who did what we were supposed to do, did so through a combination of trust and fear. But trust in what is a question that would be answered, as you describe it, by the inquiry. Sarah says, I want to know why the government kept bypassing existing infrastructure, for example, local authorities being a big example, instead passing billions to the likes of consultants for test and trace, to which I'd add, including companies that had only just been set up by people who had a history of either cronyism or actual donation to the Tory party or senior Tory figures. I mean, theoretically, this could be bigger than any other inquiry. The stakes are so much higher, and the questions that need answering so profound. It's 10:30. You're listening to James O'Brien on LBC. What do you want to know? What do you need to know? This inquiry, which is already, I would suggest, being besieged by an uncooperative government and a frightened media. What do you want to know? What do you need to know from Baroness Hallett, who we may hear from shortly, or indeed we may not? The number you need, as always, 0345 6060 973. It's 10:31. Lottie Morley has your headlines. 10:34 is the time, and I make no apology for this kind of thing, because it's just an evidence or an indication of how much there is and how impossible it is for any one individual to be across everything. But the story I referred to a moment ago regarding Michelle Mone was actually from January of this year. I just managed to miss it at the time. And I was referring to a High Court document made public in January that sets out the legal claim against PPE MedPro by the Department of Health and Social Care. Thereafter, the return of £122 million in public money paid for the supply of equipment that was found not to be fit for purpose. But the thing I was referring to, the certificate, refers to this quote in the legal claim from the Department of Health and Social Care. PPE MedPro was found to have supplied a test report numbered SHAT, appropriately enough, 066 489 48491, purporting to be from an entity called Intertech, but which Intertech denied having issued. As a result, MedPro was referred to the MHRA's compliance unit for further investigation. And this is the company linked to the Conservative peer Michelle Mone, the one which was awarded all sorts of contracts shortly after she, within weeks of her approaching Conservative ministers directly and offering to supply PPE through, quotes, my team in Hong Kong, end quotes. So go on. Look me in the eye and tell me, Sue Gray's report was a witch hunt, her appointment by Keir Starmer was a conspiracy, and there's nothing to see here. It's mad, isn't it? The more it unfolds. Sheila is in Sidcup. Sheila, what's wrong? Surely you were expecting to get on. We haven't rung you up, have we, and taken you by surprise?
I thought you passed me over.
Never.
No, what I want, James, is to know the sequence of events, who did what, when, and why. And also whether or not, if anything like this was to happen again, whether or not there ought to be a cross-party together. So there can't be any of this blame and calling at the end of it. I mean, it was just such an unknown, wasn't it, really? We didn't know. And I mean, when they said, do this, do that, and will people be prepared to do this or that if anything like that happens again?
It doesn't sound like a lot to ask, does it?
No.
I'd just like to know what happened, please, James, is what you're really saying. And, I appreciate some of it might be sensitive or some of it might be... I don't know what would be sensitive, but some of it might be irrelevant. But I'd just like to know what did actually happen, at the chronology of it, the decision-making process, the fingerprints upon each decision, the rationales, the reasons if they got stuff wrong, the explanation as to why, the defence as to why they got it wrong, the admission that it was wrong, but nobody's perfect. 2020 hindsight is a wonderful thing.
Absolutely.
You're bound to make mistakes. Some of them will be completely forgivable. We'd just like to know what they are, please, because... it was us. Yeah. It was all of us.
Yeah. And then we got more faith in them if anything like this should ever happen again, that we'll sort of know that they've taken all that information on board and that they'll try and do better next time.
Well, that would be, in normal circumstances or in a normal country, that would be the only priority that mattered. But that front page of the Telegraph yesterday is really haunting me, because that looks a lot to me like attempts to ensure that if it does ever happen again, we prioritise economy over lives, which is what they were calling for all along, of course.
Yeah, absolutely.
Optimistic, confident, Sheila? Do you think that, I like the look of Baroness Hallett, I've got to be honest. She's speaking...
Yeah. Truth to whatever. Yeah. No,
truth
hopefully.
To power. Yeah,
truth to power. That's the one.
You need someone to do it. Sorry, I'm sorry for taking you by surprise there, Sheila, after you rang my show and asked to come on air. But I look forward to doing it again. 10:38 is the time. We don't currently have a feed to the COVID inquiry, but we'll definitely be catching up with what Baroness Hallett had to say at some point in the next few years. Karen's in Swansea. Karen, what would you like to say?
Oh, hi, James. I wanted to talk about, I think the main question has to be about the PPE. As a nurse who worked throughout COVID, I'm now left totally disabled by long COVID.
Oh, that doesn't get enough coverage, does it? Really?
No,
it's not, no. You must feel abandoned on several fronts.
Completely abandoned. In fact, I'm still employed at the moment, but I am about to lose my job, I'm sure of that, because I can no longer work. I mean, I still class myself as one of the lucky ones. I lost friends, they died, and, normally when this sort of thing happens in the workplace, it's classed as an industrial accident.
Yes.
Now,
yes.
my friends died, and they carried on dying throughout the pandemic. No mitigations were put in place, and we were still issued with shoddy PPE. The thinnest pennies I've ever seen in aprons that I've ever seen in my career. Gloves that you'd put your fingers straight through. And I think they don't want the truth to come out, because it will come out that they were so busy giving contracts to their mates who had no experience in producing PPE, and it left NHS staff open to this disease.
And as I mentioned a moment ago, I didn't have the proper name of it. Boris Johnson scrapped the government's Threats, Hazards, Resilience and Contingency Committee 6 months before the coronavirus arrived in Britain, so they could focus on Brexit.
Morning. Yeah.
I only read that this morning. Again, I remember reading it a couple of years ago, actually. I think it appeared in 2020. I think our friend Lucy Easthope had something to do with bringing that to the attention of the nation, actually. But it comes round again, doesn't it? And you marvel, or you stare at it goggle-eyed again and think of, well, if all this stuff, Karen, is happening in plain sight, what the hell is still in darkness?
And that's what I think they want to. They're so desperate to cover that up, because they're opening themselves to litigation. You know, we should have compensation for not being looked after, not being protected. I mean, I've never seen such a sham in all my life.
You're poorly now. God knows for how long, possibly forever. I really hope not, obviously. And in any other sort of industrial scenario or workplace scenario, there'd be a duty of care from your employer to.
They, and the worst thing is they labelled us as heroes, and then they just threw us on the scrap heap. If you died, your life was worth £60,000.
I'm sorry.
That's.
She's got her work cut out, hasn't she, this Baroness?
Yeah. And I just hope to God she gets to the bottom of this, because.
Well, the first thing the government have tried to do is deny her access to evidence that she wants to see, but
How are they to? The whole point of the inquiry was to learn lessons, and if they start it on a web of lies, there's no lessons going to be learned, and that just shows that they never intended on learning lessons.
It is incredible, actually, and to see it from your perspective must be doubly harrowing, because the impact upon you. Albeit, I see why you say you were one of the lucky ones if you lost friends and colleagues, but. It's all relative, isn't it? Compared to the people who walked away with £100 million worth of PPE contracts, I don't think anyone would call you the lucky one, Karen. 10:42 is the time. Take care. I promise we'll keep an eye on long COVID. We will cover it. We'll come back to it soon. It's one of those stories I'm aware that I could talk about every day. It's like AI or the climate. It remains of epic importance to huge numbers of people. But the nature of this particular beast is that you just can't do that. I'd have no platform at all if I started doing that every day. If I sound a little bit embarrassed, that's because I am. There is guilt there for me, especially when I talk to Karen. Hayden's in Croydon. Hayden, what would you like to say?
Hi, James. Thanks for taking my call. Following on from your previous caller, I feel I'm very much one of the lucky ones. I did get ill with COVID a couple of times, but I didn't die. No one close to me died. But in answer to your question, what would I like from this inquiry? I would like to be able to feel confident that the government aren't just simply looking after themselves, engaging in yet another PR campaign, hoping to be voted in again next time.
Or keeping stuff out of the public space for long enough to get the election out of the way before it comes out. More so than any, because I don't think they can scupper much beyond trying to keep evidence out of Baroness Hallett's hand. But they will certainly be crossing their fingers and hoping any delay that they're responsible for example, the current one, will increase the likelihood of the revelations coming out after a general election.
Quite right. And I mean, I said to your producer just now, I mean, a secondary outcome that I would like to see from this is characters like Johnson and Hancock and Dido Harding and all the other ones nailed to the wall. But the most important thing is that we as a population can feel confident that the next time the pandemic comes around, because there inevitably will be one at some stage, we're better prepared. We know what we're going to do. There won't be any debates about whether lockdown is the right thing to do or not. There won't be any debates about whether wearing a mask makes any difference. None of this nonsense. No. We'll know what to do, and we'll feel confident the government has got our interests at heart, not their interests at heart.
I share all of those concerns, but oddly, far be it from me to gallop to the defence of this bunch, but oddly, I don't think there was much coming out of government that was responsible for attempts to undermine lockdowns or undermine mask wearing or undermine many of the measures that...
No, I think that's fair.
They did things too slowly.
There was a headless chicken kind of feel about the whole thing.
There was, but I think, having witty and balance there, I think they prevailed most of the time, but that's something we can add to the list of things we need to know, is tell us about the times they didn't prevail. It looks a lot like Eat Out to Help Out was undertaken in direct contradiction of medical advice, or indeed involving Rishi Sunak sticking his fingers in his ears so that he couldn't hear any medical advice on that one. And I remember thinking at the time, because there was a spike shortly afterwards, and you thought, well, there's a blooming surprise. There's a surprise. But, and do you know, The Telegraph actually published an article about me during that. I had a little Twitter, what would you call it, a Twitter exchange with a restaurateur. It seemed to me fairly obvious that there would be a link between Eat Out to Help Out and the spike that appeared shortly afterwards. But it was, again, The Telegraph that sought to try and rubbish my position on that. Me, little old me, in a national newspaper. Who'd have thought it? It's almost as if they were terrified of truth. It is 10:46. 10 to 11 is the time. Tess writes, I would be interested to know why they didn't stop flights sooner. The half-term holiday in February meant a lot of families travelling to Italy, which had an outbreak at the time. People were flying back with no restrictions, allowing the virus in. God, you forget so much, Tess. I remember we were sitting here. I think Sadiq Khan was with us on one occasion when we were absolutely incredulous about the complete absence of checks or measures in place at Heathrow Airport. You could see what was happening in other countries, and there were no checks or measures, let alone actual flight bans, which other countries contemplated and introduced. She continues, I would like to think that they learnt lessons on things they need to look at more quickly in future. We're an island. We could have been more restrictive on travellers from the start, which maybe would have meant it not getting so out of control if people had isolated more on their return. I think Japan is the comparison there, actually, more than anywhere else. Similar size population, similar insular status, and I mean, very different numbers as well. I don't think we ended up being among the worst. I could be wrong. That's what I mean by there being so much to remember and so much to hold in your head at the same time. But the point is that everything could have been so infinitely better if... Well, we think. But there you go. There's another answer to the question. I would like to have my suspicion that things could have gone a lot better removed. I'd like to actually, horrible though it would be, knowledge is better than uncertainty. Certainty is better than uncertainty. I'd like to know that, yeah, okay, they did make some mistakes in good faith, and they learned from those mistakes, and they got things right subsequently. And that's another reason why I'd like to see the exchanges between the decision makers, so you can actually get rid of that miasma, that fog of scepticism and suspicion that hangs over so much of that period of time. I'd put that on the list as well. Still got time to squeeze you in. 0345 60 60973. Things that probably would have a lot more attention. You know, it is funny, apart from the Financial Times and especially The Guardian, when I go searching for these stories that I can only half remember, that's the only place I find them often is The Guardian. So the story about Boris Johnson shutting down the pandemic planning department 6 months before coronavirus arrived had not had anything like the coverage that you'd expect in a normal country, prioritising the people in it over cosy relationships with the people in charge. And the Michelle Mone story I referred to earlier about the UK's health products watchdog looking into whether a false document was presented to the government when they were tendering for all those juicy multi-million pound PPE contracts. Some of that money, of course, subsequently spent on a yacht. We've had technical problems, I'm afraid, with our link to the COVID inquiry. Baroness Hallett's opening comments, I'm told, were fairly procedural, so we haven't missed anything substantive on the question of these still missing WhatsApps or these High Court attempts to keep them out of the hands of Baroness Hallett. But, of course, the questions of what you need to know from this inquiry remain. And not just what you need to know, what you'd quite like to know, what you want to know. Joe says, I still have a huge query about why Boris Johnson only received one fine when there were apparently so many breaches, and apparently a fine only for what was arguably the most forgivable, i.e. the surprise birthday party. It looked like a token fine or appeasement to me, and a cover-up for more wrongdoings. It's an accusation there towards Sue Gray of being anything but a witch hunter or part of a hatchet job. My understanding, actually, Joe, tallies with your suspicions. My understanding is that Sue Gray, as a civil servant, is regarded as a mistress of parameters. She will, when charged with a task, never go any further than the tightest parameters that task demands, which is partly why there has been some surprise in some circles about Baroness Hallett getting hold of evidence that apparently there were more parties, both at Chequers and in the flat at Downing Street, that were not covered by Sue Gray's investigation, and they will be looked into by Baroness Hallett's inquiry, and that perhaps may be another reason why there is an enthusiasm to keep this stuff out of the public sphere, never mind the inquiry's hands. Betty's in Glasgow. Betty, what would you like to say?
Oh, gosh, so much.
Well, take your time. I can give you 4 or 5 minutes if you want, but take your time either way.
I won't take that long, although I could. It could be hours, not minutes.
Yes, fair enough.
Take it right back to what you saw in China, you saw in Italy.
Yes.
At that time, we saw that, so we didn't lock down. We waited and we waited and we waited. And there was people that were waiting to be told to lock down, and other people just did it off their own bat. I locked down because I was shielding during that period of November when, by that point, Boris Johnson had his Independence Day on the 4th of July where everybody was to be released and party on. My son had an accident during the second part of that in November 2020. He fell off a roof. It was life or death. Wasn't allowed in to see him. They let me in eventually after fighting for so long, and that was my first day out. I followed every single rule laid down, not only by Scottish Government but by British Government. We followed every rule, and then I left my home to go and see my son. It could have been the last time I saw him. I didn't know any different. They told me when I left the hospital, you don't want to see us again, because if he called you again, it's because he's dying. And they did call me. They called me, it turns out, on the night that they were partying upstairs in Downing Street. I sat by my son's bedside the 13th and the 14th. On the 15th, he took a turn for the better. And I put that down to the fact that he had family around him and he heard us. Now, he had a long slog for 2 years to get back on his feet. He would have did that quicker had we... But I was never allowed to see him again until March.
Where was the pressure? Where were all these pressures coming from? I do find this... We forget the role. I was looking at the phone log that Hallett's got hold of, the visits or the meetings Johnson had with major media figures. What were they talking about with regard to discouraging this and discouraging that? And there's a disconnect, isn't there? Lucy Easthope, I really, really recommend her book, When the Dust Settles, and also her interview with me on Full Disclosure, because she talks about them prioritising optics over substance. So they needed to make something or do something that looked good. So you and me and millions of others are clamouring for meaningful policy, and they're postponing and postponing and postponing, and we're looking at the pictures in Italy and think, well, you've got to be doing something, and we're looking at Heathrow and thinking, how the hell can this be happening? Or the Cheltenham Festival, do you remember that? Matt Hancock's constituency, I think. And so when they did stuff, it looked as if, in retrospect, this is Lucy's point, it was done to look good, not to do good. Yeah. That's a good phrase.
Everything was done on the hop. There wasn't any thought process. It was just get this done, get that. Okay, then that looks good. Let's go out there now at 5 o'clock and tell the British public that we've did A, B and C, and they'll be all right with that. But there's a party tonight. Let's go cheese and wine in the garden, or cheese and wine upstairs, or oh gosh, my interior designer's here. Let's bring her in as well, and we'll all have a wee cheers to Boris because it's his birthday. I don't blooming think so. No. People died. Hundreds of thousands of people died, and it's actually vile, because I can understand to a point not being able to get in to see my son, because the nurses and doctors were scared. They had to go home to their families.
So what did our government know, and when did they know it, and why didn't they respond when they should have?
Yeah.
Why did he miss all those?
Well, that
Cobra
cuts
meetings?
both ways. I think the clever money says he missed all the Cobra meetings because he was trying to deliver a Shakespeare biography because his finances. I'm not joking. His finances were in such a mess, and of
He
course
had a divorce to pay for.
Well, the proof of the fact that his finances were in such a mess popped up a couple of years later when the bloke that he subsequently appointed as chairman of the BBC helped to facilitate a loan from a distant cousin who guaranteed it to the tune of £800,000.
Yeah.
After being essentially introduced by Simon Case, the cabinet secretary, who is, of course, in the news again today. Yes, again today, still in the Post, still in the news. And it was him, of course, that kicked off about Sue Gray's appointment to the Labour Party. And he's been sitting on the news that there's nothing to see here for 2 weeks. I've just learned. 2 weeks.
Yeah, 2 weeks.
But hey-ho.
While, corruption to the end, and I think that's the problem. They don't want anybody to see exactly how corrupt. As you say, if this is what's in the public sphere, what's underneath all that?
What the hell is in private? I keep stumbling across stuff I'd either forgotten or hadn't noticed the first time around. It's happened this morning with at least 2 or 3 different stories. Thank you, Betty. Apologies to Gillian and Robert, Susan, Peter and others. We will return to this territory. I'm not quite getting it right. I don't want to sound ungrateful for the calls that we've got. They were brilliant, lovely people, powerful calls, but we're not quite. Maybe it's because we're so lonely. Maybe it's because it is pretty much only us currently exploring this, and you need a little bit longer to get your engagement levels up to bring back those horrible feelings that we dealt with during that period of time. The stuff that we were feeling and talking about during the catastrophe, during the lockdowns, for example. We shall see what hell it does, because lethargy would be a huge ally to the people seeking to keep the truth away from the people. It would be an absolutely enormous ally to them, so we must continue to do our bit to battle it. I have 2 education-related stories for you today, one involving claims that degrees are worthless, and the other involving teachers. Well, I'll tell you in a minute. 3 minutes after 11, we've got someone at the High Court, but you can't get on the judge's nerves. This is why I would not have been a very good court reporter. In fact, you can remove the word court from that observation, I think, in most contexts. So you can't, Fraser Knight can't be hopping in and out every 20 minutes to bring us up to date with what's going on in court, because it really hacks off the judges. So we have got someone. Fraser is there for us, and we will be catching up with him, but you're probably best off trusting the bulletins. You can always trust the bulletins on LBC, but the bulletins will bring you up to date with any developments at this absolutely unprecedented intervention. I may read you some of the evidence that he's giving. It is huge for both legal and historical reasons, not to mention media reasons. There's 3 battles now. Rupert Murdoch, Daily Mail, Mirror Group. There's 3 battles now being fought by a variety of public figures. Incredibly high-profile, prominent public figures, many of them, not all of them. But there are 3 battles now being fought on this front, which makes it all the more pertinent that it was Theresa May who decided to call time on the Leveson inquiry. The second part of the Leveson inquiry was going to look at, among other things, complicity between the police and the media in cover-ups and coverage. Various other elements as well of potentially scandalous behaviour. But it was Theresa May who decided to abandon Leveson 2. I forget whether it was shortly before or shortly afterwards. The Daily Mail gave her a front page describing the steel of the new Iron Lady, which I'm sure is a complete coincidence. But I do find myself wondering what Leveson 2 might have done, or what impacts it might have had upon some of these unfolding stories, let alone the historical ones that are being examined in court in the case that Prince Harry is giving evidence on today. I'll get his witness statement and give you a little bit more detail from that. But it is quite lengthy, and as I say, it is huge. But Fraser can only be with us punctuation. He can only be with us sporadically. That's the word I was looking for. Otherwise, the judge would probably throw him in the cells beneath the High Court for contempt. So we're going to move on to something completely different, as Monty Python almost said. 6 minutes after 11. This is a really mad survey. It always takes surveys with a pinch of salt, and you always need to double check the provenance of them, because some of these surveys are, of course, commissioned by the sort of outfits that managed somehow to get that story on the front page of yesterday's Daily Telegraph. But this one looks both pertinent and kosher. 78% of secondary teachers said they would leave teaching now if they were offered a job in a different sector with a better work-life balance. A survey of 1,000 staff. 64% said they'd move for better pay, but the work-life balance was an even bigger consideration. I'm looking at I would say that's 3/4 would quit if they could find a new job with a better work-life balance. But it's the crisis in staff room morale that this research looks at directly, and that's what I want you to talk to me about today. Listen, I know a lot of teachers are going to be in classrooms. You might have had an inset day yesterday off the back of half term, but that doesn't necessarily mean you could have rung me either. But there'll be enough teachers listening for us to get a better handle on what's going on here. Because what really worries me, and what I don't know how to talk about this anymore, I really don't. When I was a younger man, I was very good. This is quite weird. Come here a minute. I need to confide something in you. When I was young, a young radio presenter, not that young, I was a bit of a, what would the word be? When you'd be very strict. I used to defend corporal punishment before I went into therapy. I used to defend corporal. Don't laugh. I did. I would defend corporal punishment. I used to go on Nicky Campbell's Sunday morning TV shows and say there's nothing right. I used to do a show called The Right Stuff on Channel 5. I remember it. I remember sitting there. I've almost got a sort of sense memory of it. Sitting there saying didn't do me any harm. And in many odd ways, I believed it. So is victim the right word? Victims of very disciplinarian schoolings, the kids who got into a lot of trouble, do they always come out the other end thinking that really harsh discipline is a good thing? I suppose you go one of two ways, do you? You either become a complete delinquent, or you end up becoming an advocate for precisely the sort of unreasonable discipline that you endured, because the alternative is to admit that it had traumatised you. I don't know, but I do know this. In my 30s, on this radio programme, I would be very front and centre in slagging off misbehaving young pupils, or revolting students, as I might have called them, in both senses of the word. Rowdy pupils is the headline in today's Times, but it's the next three words that should give us all cause for concern. Rowdy pupils driving out teachers. Now, this would be the point 15 years ago at which I would have said, well, they're the kind of pupils that need a bit of a clatter. And I'm so sorry for doing that publicly. It was so unhelpful. I know why I did it. It was all part of a sort of therapeutic need to persuade my younger self that the damage done to me by grown men from the age of about 10, when I started getting beaten formally at my prep school, all part of a therapeutic need to convince myself that it hadn't done me any harm, that it had been good for me. And of course, the moment I managed to let go of that delusion was a moment of epic progress in my inner life. I really urge anybody who's married to a man in particular who insists that corporal punishment is a good thing, if you can, get him into therapy as soon as possible, because a lot of the problems he has in his personal relationships will be down to the fact that he spent his entire life trying to convince himself that being treated appallingly by adults when he was little was not a bad thing at all, and absolutely unproblematic, and it hadn't done him any harm. So I would, in my 30s, have been somebody who would have read a story like this and said, well, I'll tell you why that is. It's because they haven't got any power in the classroom anymore. Bring back the birch. Well, I never would have said bring back the birch. But no, it can't be it. That's not. You've got to show these kids who's boss. You've got to show these. I mean, the word kids. You've got to show these kids who's boss. And I don't think that anymore. I've changed. But it means that I don't have an easy answer to this rather complicated question. Easy answers are great. You can go far in this business with easy answers to complicated questions. They don't have to be remotely relevant or true. But as long as they push the right buttons and look good in headlines, then you're home and dry. Just go, bring back the cane. Don't show them who's boss, all that sort of thing. It may be that you want to argue that it's true. You may want to claim that it's true. But a crisis in staff room morale has been fueled by a variety of things. I'll run through some of them for you. Soaring apathy. Now, that oddly ties in with a story we might do in the next hour about degrees being worthless. I think there's a growing sense among children, perhaps, if I'm reading this correctly, there's no point working hard at school because what is on the horizon for them does not seem to be, for a huge majority of school children, the relationship between effort and reward has been corrupted. They don't see the relationship between working very hard and doing very well at school, behaving at school, and their later life. I don't know whether that's different from when it was when you were young or when I was young, or whether it is something that's always been there. It's just become more prominent in recent years. So that's point number one, soaring apathy. The one that is most obviously interesting, and certainly the one that has determined this headline, is aggression. Aggression among pupils, aggression directed at teachers, pushing apparently tens of thousands of them out of their careers prematurely. The most obvious question I'm about to ask is, why did you knock it on the head? 0345 6060 973. Why did you leave teaching? All right, so that's a good way of avoiding the fact that all the actual teachers, all the people still in the profession will currently be in the classroom or the common room. Here's a good example. Hi, James. I'm a teacher on a mental health break and I'm considering my options. Should I call? Well, yes, please, as long as you fancy it and you're up to it. But the questions we're looking at are, how rowdy are the pupils and what is it that's making you consider your future? What are the factors, the key factors? Because wages, they're constantly explaining why the wages are inadequate. That's got to help. But work-life balance now overshadows pay as a reason why they're considering quitting. And if you've been listening to this programme for the last few months, that won't surprise you, because all of the teachers who rang in to explain their strike action were adamant that recruitment and retention were at least as important as a pay settlement, because with teacher shortages, their jobs are unbearable. It's the spreading so thinly of the teachers who are there that renders the experience so unpleasant for the teachers that remain. So recruitment and retention go up, work-life balance improves. You're not doing the job of 1 1/4 or 1 1/2 or 2 teachers, you're doing the job of 1 again. So that would be quite obvious. Decline in respect for teachers, which lockdown has probably contributed to, the long periods away from the classroom, something that Baroness Hallett is going to look at. Intensity and pressure of the workload, that brings us back to recruitment and retention. And then a new element, which I hope you'll be able to talk to me about, but I'll completely understand if you won't. You may prefer to talk to another woman about it, so Sheila, for example. But female teachers said they felt threatened by misogyny from male pupils influenced by toxic role models on social media, such as Andrew Tate, who's a very strange man who lives in a box in Romania under house arrest at the moment and enjoys a cult following among all sorts of among all sorts of people, particularly young people who are drawn to his very ostentatious displays of wealth through cars or other kit and caboodle. So that's part of it as well. I remember, maybe now, probably 10 years ago, a friend of mine who teaches a secondary school, a comprehensive school in, I won't tell you where it is because, well, I can tell you where it is. It's not that specific, in Dorset. And she told me about a boy who said, and there's a slight trigger warning here, he said something involving sexual assault, the worst kind of sexual assault, and I will use the word in a minute. I just wanted to give you a heads up. He said to her in the classroom, in front of everybody else, that he would rape her as a sort of, what would the word be? As a sort of aggressive verbal. I mean, she didn't feel threatened by it. She didn't think it was a meaningful threat that he intended to do, but it was an act of verbal aggression in the classroom in front of other pupils. It even put miss on the end. I remember being struck by that. And I said, well, crikey, what happens? I thought the lad would be expelled for that. Don't laugh at me for being naive. I thought that would be an expellable offence. Absolutely nothing happened. It wasn't quite commonplace, but remember, this is going back more than 10 years, so it could well be now. But there was nothing. So when I talk about discipline, I immediately think of a 6'4" man with a specially designed weapon hitting my 10-year-old hands as hard as he could until I thought they were going to drop off. But there are, of course, other ways of encouraging children to behave themselves that involve what we might describe as punishment. I'm not sure. I genuinely have nothing now in this debate because I used to have everything. All my eggs were in one very stupid basket. And now I don't know where to put them because that lad who said that thing should face consequences. And I have no idea what those consequences should be. So there you go. There's one of my characteristically verbose and meandering introductions, but you've got an idea of what we're talking about and why. If we were to boil it down to relatively straightforward questions, they would be, why are you thinking of leaving? Or, of course, why did you leave? And of the stuff we've discussed, from pupil apathy, pupil aggression, work-life balance, all of those things. I'm particularly interested today in the behaviour of the pupils and the role that has played in your career decisions or your career unhappiness. All right? It's 17 minutes after 11. You're listening to James O'Brien on LBC. It's 19 minutes after 11. I mean, one of the problems I've got is the what would you call it? The denial of just epic incompetence. So you always think, and we all do this, I'm guilty of it this morning probably, something bad happens. You think, oh, I bet that's deliberate. But people ring up and say, oh, that's a dead cat. I say, I like dead cats. Not literally. I mean, I like the theory of a dead cat in the context of government news management. But sometimes they're just really bad at stuff. You look at the last 4 prime ministers. Is it 5 or 4? Sunak, the woman who lost to the lettuce, I can't remember her name. Johnson, May, Cameron, 5. The last 5 prime ministers. And then you look at the state of the NHS or the state of schools, and you think with the NHS, yeah, they want to privatise it, and there's possibly some truth in that, but I'm sure they'd rather it was still better than it is. They're just not very good at delivering. Why would they promise 40 new hospitals if they didn't recognise that it needs to be better than it currently is? Schools, less so. There's no subtext here. I'm trying to shut down all state schools. They're just really, really bad, and they don't care. So I sort of slightly overlook that answer, that angle. They're just crap at their jobs, or rubbish at their jobs. 20 minutes after 11 is the time. Craig's in Great Yarmouth. Craig, what would you like to say? Why did you knock it on the head, or why are you thinking of doing so?
It's an increasingly impossible job to do. The challenges from when I started to what they are today are just they're fivefold easily.
When did you start? And then talk me through the challenges.
I started around 2006.
Oh Lord, okay.
So a little while.
Yeah,
so
but not like so not man and boy, is it? It's not even 20 years yet. And so give me the key, particularly with reference to pupil conduct, as it were. Are you at school at the moment? It sounds like you're preparing for class.
No, I'm not at school at the moment. Right. My son's off poorly today,
I'm
doing the parental thing while he kills people on Xbox. It's just, I think that in my experience, it just seems to really boil down with parental engagement.
Okay.
Quite often, the behaviour policies and the sanctions set up by all schools involve time away from classroom. So typically, if somebody misbehaves in class, that results in a detention. Often, students are seeing that as the ones where you really want it to be effective. They're seeing that as an opportunity to get out of learning and get out of the classroom.
Yeah.
If they don't attend their detention, then they have perhaps possibly a fixed term exclusion. They're in the day in isolation. If they don't attend that, they're a fixed term exclusion for a few days, and that's an additional few days off of school.
So none of this not for every kid getting it. Some kids are going to go home and tell their parents that this has happened, and they're going to be in a world of trouble. No, but
yeah,
not enough, and that's the big change. So 15 years ago, that would have been an effective punishment, and now it isn't.
Well, yeah, to a degree. I realise I'm just speaking from personal experience, but the thought of getting a detention when I was at school a long, long time ago would have been mortifying. Having to go home and tell my parents, and I would have had a really unpleasant conversation when I got home as well.
Same here.
But the thing is now when the ultimate goal is to be out of the classroom, then actually everything's set up to kind of effectively give that student what they want.
And
they're
I feel
away
bad
from
now.
the learning and away from the classroom.
I feel guilty now for laughing with Mark Steele on this week's Full Disclosure about when he got expelled from school. He pretty much adopted precisely the position you've just described. So I can't believe that they were punishing me for not turning up to school by telling me that I didn't have to come to school anymore. But he's a funny guy, and he's done all right in life. He's also a lovely bloke, but not for 13, 14, 15-year-olds. This would not be helpful.
No, and at the same time, from personal experience, it only seems the tools that schools have only seem to work and be effective if you have the parents working with the school. And quite often, comments coming back like, well, I don't agree with why my child has got that detention, so they won't be doing it. I've told them not to go.
Gosh.
Where do you're kind of left feeling very powerless.
Yeah, of course you are.
And that's made it harder. If teaching was that easy, everyone would be doing it, wouldn't they? To be fair, we get absolutely slated by government ministers talking about how we've had it too easy during lockdown, and the amount of time off we get. Certain people in the media posting about how easy teachers are and that they're all lazy. If it was that easy and it was that well paid, everyone would be on it,
goes without
and there wouldn't be a shortage of teachers.
Can you detect gear changes? I mean, we're looking at quite a broad period of time, quite a long period of time. Are there moments, or is it incremental? It's just gradually got worse. Did kids come back? Did young people come back from lockdown measurably worse in this field, particularly with reference to parental support?
I think, but in both ways, yeah. On one hand, a lot of parents were very happy to obviously be back, being able to go back to work and not have to worry about how they were going to look after their children at home. But having that period of time during lockdown, a lot of children seem to be less able to cope, less resilient to cope with typical challenges that would have been kind of, a foregone conclusion for a lot of people prior to lockdown.
Well, I suppose for some of them, they might have gone through the motions, but some of them would have been kicking their heels for weeks on end, wouldn't they? They wouldn't have been engaging in online learning, or at least on anything like the level that they would engage in real life learning. And it's almost as if you're punishing them by robbing them of all the free time and freedom that they had during lockdown.
Absolutely. It's mostly, the biggest trend I've noticed with students post-lockdown is how they resolve social problems. Often they escalate to the point where they're getting themselves into trouble over very minor things, falling out either with a teacher who is given instruction they don't like, or just simply falling out with their peers and falling out with their friendship groups.
That's interesting.
So, and personally, I wouldn't be able to give you a statistic because I don't have an overview. But
I don't need statistics on days like this.
But it does.
It's your life.
Personally, it does appear that cases of bullying have increased as well. So, but that's just my personal view. I mean, other people might.
I know. Well, it's unregulated behaviour, isn't it? And lockdown would have definitely incubated an unregulated behaviour. Craig, thank you. I'm not looking for statistics today. I'm looking for teachers, either current or ex, explaining or responding to research that suggests that badly behaved pupils in particular are forcing teachers out of the profession. That and the work-life balance. Steve's in Birmingham. Steve, what would you like to say?
Hi, James. It's something I wanted to raise, actually, was when you were talking about discipline in the classroom earlier, and you mentioned that your friend who'd suffered that kind of verbal abuse from a student. I think most people don't realise that if a school wants to, we say permanently exclude now as well, we don't say expel anymore. I noticed you said that earlier. If you want to permanently exclude a child, the school is laden with the bill for that alternate provision. Okay, so funding comes from the government for each child. Let's say it's somewhere between £5,000 and £6,000 a year for each child per year. They're burdened with paying for that student to go elsewhere if they want to get rid of them. Now, my wife works in an alternate provision school, and they charge about £16,000 a year to take a child in.
Good Lord.
If you understand what I mean.
So that budget then, that's a a third of a teaching assistant, or the heating bill, or comes off school dinners, because we forget that most head teachers these days have to manage the budget in a way that once would have been done by the LEA. So if I exclude that kid, I've got to find up that child. I keep saying kid, I don't know, it's not a particularly unpleasant word, but it's unhelpful in these contexts. If I exclude that child, I've got to find the money to pay for their, is it PRU place? AP they say now, alternate provision they tend to say. Right. But you've got to find probably another, 10, 12 grand a year to cover that cost. And if you're doing that with 10 kids, 10 students, that's £100,000 a year, isn't it? So would you be therefore more relaxed about truanting then? I mean, if a troubled kid just stops turning up, then
oh, well, you're going back to our day at school there, James.
I'm doing everything. I know, I'm a mess.
If you dropped off school, nobody really cared. The wagman might have come to your house and knocked on to see if you were there.
I slept at my school, so it was very, very hard to play truant. Although I did pull it off.
Okay,
I did pull it off on a couple of occasions, but that's not an option now. So what happens? The disruptive children are just accommodated within the school, even though everybody recognises that under a functional system they would have been. And I'm not going to say excluded. I'm going to say they would have been offered help.
Yeah, well, very often what a lot of schools do now is they'll put their own PRU into place.
Right.
Somewhere, but obviously that's very limited, and it has to be staffed.
Yes.
In different ratios to an ordinary classroom. So if you've got a PRU, you probably have to have like one member of staff for every 4 students, as opposed to one for every 30 in the main body of the school, and so on and so on. You see, and it's a very, very complex system. And just to go back to your other thing about budgets as well, since the academisation of state schools, what you very often had was very, very good head teachers who suddenly became business managers in charge of millions of pounds worth of funding every year. And you tend to be dealing with a bunch of people who've never done anything but go to school.
Yeah. I mean, that is an amazing thing, isn't it, to reflect upon? They're expected to become masters of all trades almost overnight.
Absolutely, yeah. And of course, not everybody is very good, and some people are, there's all sorts of, favoritism and cliquiness in schools and all the rest of it because of the nature of the environment. That's how people are, or a lot of people are, and it just became very toxic. And suddenly you got these people who were in charge of all this money and didn't have to do all this ridiculous workload that was laden to them by outside agencies like Ofsted anymore, and then start bouncing that down onto people that they perhaps didn't get on with. And schools became impossible. I left 7 years ago and I went into higher education, and I've never looked back. I still have to work late at night, but nothing on the scale that I did before.
Well, I don't think anyone can fault it. I mean, that's the point, isn't it? And that's more work-life balance than actual rowdy pupils, as the Times calls them. But it's a miracle that anybody's left in our schools. And looking into this research a little bit further, the main reason that they are is that they can't find anything better to do. You were lucky that you could. Quite a few people get in touch telling me they found a role, but they're rare. You walk away from the profession altogether, but you've trained for it, you've dreamt of it. It's a mess. It's 11:31. Lottie Morley's here now with your headlines. 11:34 is the time. The witness statement from Prince Harry continuing to, as you heard, dominate Lottie's news bulletin there, and much of the conversation in news coverage this morning. I just want to run you through a few things that you might not be aware of, because I'm looking for examples of what he said in the last, or what he said in this witness statement about Piers Morgan in particular, which is particularly interesting when you remember how virulent the abuse of Prince Harry and particularly his wife Meghan Markle by Piers Morgan has been over the years. And also, I'd remind you of what Jeremy Clarkson said about hating her viscerally. I forget the exact phrase that he used, but a visceral hatred, I think. And dreaming, lying awake at night, dreaming of her being forced to parade naked through the streets while people throw excrement at her. I don't know if anyone's ever said that about your loved ones, but it would be a fairly jarring moment. But Clarkson, of course, writes for 2 or 3 Rupert Murdoch titles. I'm just going to run you through some, because the question of how much coverage is this going to get elsewhere, and how much you as a punter rely upon this kind of information coming to you via news outlets. And don't forget that even this job, quite a lot of people in this line of work, behind microphones, still feel more loyal to Fleet Street than they do to their listeners, or they do to the general public. I used to. I remember fighting frequently with Alistair Campbell about press regulation until, for a variety of reasons, I came to understand just how rotten the newspaper industry in this country was. So I'm just going to, looking at what he said about Piers Morgan, Prince Harry, the thought of Piers Morgan and his band of journalists earwagging into my mother's private and sensitive messages in the same way as they have me, and then having given her a nightmare time 3 months prior to her death in Paris, nightmare time is a quote, makes me feel physically sick and even more determined to hold those responsible, including Mr. Morgan, accountable for their vile and entirely unjustified behaviour. He goes on, unfortunately, as a consequence of me bringing my Mirror Group claim, both myself and my wife have been subjected to a barrage of horrific personal attacks and intimidation from Piers Morgan, who was the editor of the Daily Mirror between 1995 and 2004, presumably in retaliation and in the hope that I will back down before being able to hold him properly accountable for his unlawful activity towards both me and my mother during his editorship. Piers Morgan, of course, denies all wrongdoing, and the Mirror Group deny most of the charges against them today. I think he said recently that he was not going to take lectures on privacy invasion from the Duke of Sussex. So my information, I don't know whether this is true or not, but just to give you an idea of how it all works, and therefore how likely it is that any of this will be reported with quite the salaciousness that they reported details of Prince Harry's private life. Remember, this is happening in public. I was told once that Piers Morgan was Paul Dacre's choice to replace him as editor of the Daily Mail. I don't know whether that's true or not, but my source on that was impeccable. What I do know is that Rupert Murdoch offered Paul Dacre the editorship of the Times, which forced the hand of the owner of the Daily Mail into moving Sir David English and putting Paul Dacre in charge of the Daily Mail. But Murdoch wanted him at the Times. When he was at the Daily Mail, he had a deputy editor called Tony Gallagher, who has subsequently gone on to edit the Daily Telegraph, The Sun, and now The Times. So that's 4 newspapers, 2 men. Add Piers Morgan to the mix, who edited both the News of the World and the Daily Mirror. That's 7 newspapers and 3 men, all of whom will be chummy and all of whom will have arrangements in place that ensure that not only if I scratch my back, you scratch my back, I'll scratch yours, but also, of course, that we won't air each other's dirty laundry in public. So Gallagher in particular is fascinating because he's managed to be deputy editor of the Daily Mail, editor of the Daily Telegraph, editor of the Sun, and now editor of the Times. So what will the Times, which is in so many other areas the newspaper of repute, the only newspaper of repute left in this country that's not ostensibly left-wing, i.e. there's only The Guardian, really, and then you've got the FT, which occupies a unique space. So the editor of The Times has already edited The Sun, The Telegraph, and deputy edited the Daily Mail, describing Paul Dacre as, in many ways, his hero. So that's what is meant sometimes when people talk about a sort of almost mafioso nature to the print media in this country. What is the likelihood of any of those men telling the truth about each other's operations, let alone their own? I don't know. Maybe the likelihood is huge. But just in terms of why don't these stories get the coverage you might expect them to get, I thought that might have been a little bit helpful for you. Maybe not. Maybe so. But that's what I'm here for. And we'll find a little bit more from these issues. Here's a good one about Paul Burrell. Do you remember them? Witness statement referred to a 2003 article detailing an alleged row between him and his brother William. You remember him? Over their mother's former butler, Paul Burrell. You remember him? He said he hadn't wanted our disagreement about how to handle the situation splashed across the newspapers, and he would have used the phrase two-face bleep, as reported, and believes that it was directly lifted from his voicemail. One of the articles put before the trial is a report from The People, headlined, "Will's seeing Burrell is the only way to stop him selling more Diana secrets. Harry, no, Burrell's a bleep." He said the article accurately sets out the position that my brother was open to fixing a meeting with Paul to discuss his ongoing exposés about our mother. However, I had made up my mind about the kind of person I thought Paul was and was firmly against meeting him at this point in my life. That's what he's been dealing with. That was 20 years ago. I've often expressed to you my complete, well, not bafflement, I know where it comes from, but for ordinary members of the public to have treated these two people like dirt for so long, partly because, of course, she is of mixed race, and partly because he has taken a flamethrower, really, to the pyramid of deference upon which this country relies. If somebody like him can refuse to, quotes, know his place, end quotes, and go along with whatever he's required to go along with, then how stupid must everybody who hates their life but thinks they have to put up with it further down the pyramid feel? You know, this cult of deference that we have in this country. I understand why the newspapers are terrified of him and attack her as if she was some sort of serial killer. And I understand that a lot of that seeps through into the general public. But 10 seconds on Twitter, and you look at this stuff, And you just wonder what the hell has happened. I thought you cared about Diana, Princess of Wales. I thought she was the Princess of Hearts. That little boy walking behind her coffin all those years ago, and then spends his adult life dealing with the fact, the fear, the knowledge, the suspicion that he was being treated like well, you can read it for yourself in the witness statement. We firmly believed that she, my mother, should have expected some privacy in death, especially from someone she had trusted, and we were so upset at the way he was behaving. I didn't want to hear his reasons for it, and his allegation, denied by the Mirror, is that a voicemail message would have been hacked from his phone and made its way into the pages of a national newspaper. 11:42 is the time. I'll keep an eye on that for you as I filter through the witness statement and developments in court as we return to the question of what role rowdy pupils are playing in driving teachers out of the profession. Sam's in Rickmansworth. Sam, what would you like to say?
Hello.
Sorry.
That's all right. It was very interesting. I started teaching in 2003, gave up in 2021. And for me, the big question, and I constantly feel so guilty with all these teacher shortages, is why won't I go back? Because I absolutely love teaching. I love being in the classroom. I love the kids. I love everything about it, except. And it's that really big except, and I think it feeds into the people behaviour.
Yeah.
I think what we've done and what the system has done over the years is remove the humanity from teaching. And actually what's happened is these students now become data points. And we quantify everything. Yeah. So just a brief sort of background. When a child sits their SATs exam, what happens at secondary school is they're given, the algorithm comes out with a flight path. So it says this child who did a maths and an English test whenever is now expected to get between, let's call it a 4 and a 5. And that's their flight path. And we give that to them in year 7, and year 7, year 8, year 9, year 10. So everything has been quantified. This is where you're supposed to be sitting within the system. And from a teaching point of view, as long as they are within that band, you sit at rated 0. And a 0 basically means that they are on target.
Right.
If you want to progress in your career, you have to go through the threshold to go up any further pay scales out of the main pay scale, and you need to be value adding. And this is where parents who look at schools will see, oh, look, it's got a plus 0.8 value added or a 1 point. Essentially what that means is the children were given a predicted grade of a 4 or 5. If you can get them a 6, you get plus 1. If they lose a parent, if they have a chronic illness, if they end up with a 3, you're on a -1.
And you might have kept them alive. I mean, I'm being a bit of hyperbole there, but you might have made an enormous difference in their life.
Correct. And they might have had that real moment of joy where they understood something with Shakespeare, or where you presented this poem and they went, wow, that's how I feel. And those moments are irrelevant in teaching at the moment. They are completely irrelevant. We do not have even half a term of teaching where you teach for the joy of it, where you say, let's make a project where we all create an advert. You know, I used to do that back in the day. You know, if you were going to make a TV series, could we design it from start to finish? What would you do? How? And they work on it for weeks and it's all a group. None of that happens now, because if you can't quantify it, if you can't give it a level and it doesn't fit into the data, then you don't have the time. You're not allowed to teach like that, because we have created this system where everybody is reduced to a number. And the children know it as well, right? The children know. They know that you've written learning objective up on the board. You know, in lots of schools, that's the prescriptive. You have to have your learning objective up on the board. The child has to have copied that into their exercise book as the start of the lesson, so that they can quantify what they learnt in those 45 minutes or 60 minutes that they were with you.
Like an audit.
Absolutely.
When did it change?
When
did it change, Sam, in your 18 years in the profession?
I reckon it changed about 7 years ago, maybe.
So Gove territory time.
Yes.
Was it Gove?
Yes.
16.
And it's become prescriptive. And the problem is, that's where the children behave badly. And I think we've always had this thing of, you know, do parents have support? Do parents let kids get away with it? You know, that's not a news story for me. Have I, you know, had violent episodes with children who've acted out? Yes. Have we had children that are suicidal? Yes. I used to be pastoral as well.
Right.
So that's not new. Those are the things that the media can report. Those are the things that you can point to as a big noisy event and go, look, there's the problem. The problem, in my opinion, is the curriculum, the predicted grades, the quantifying of children.
Well, the absence of humanity. What would?
Yeah, it is the absence of humanity.
Can I ask what you do instead, or would that be intrusive?
No, I started my own business.
Okay.
I run a small business. I work lots and lots of hours. I am dealing with all sorts of numbers and people. And in terms of stress, my stress levels aren't any less.
Okay.
But I'm happier.
Yes,
I'm happier on a day-to-day basis.
Would you go back to the job that it was when you started?
Yes.
In a heartbeat?
In a heartbeat, immediately. I desperately miss being in the classroom. And I've actually, with my kids and my family, I've said once both my boys are at university, I'd love to do something, even if it's a revision program or, something to still help kids, because I am actually a teacher.
Yes.
I am.
And
in my very core.
Your vocation, that's the word. I know it gets overused a little bit, but I rarely hear a more clear exemplar of what the word actually means. There speaks a vocation denied by, among other things, Michael Gove's obsession with methodology. Sam, thank you. I'm a little late for the break. It's the only reason I'm moving on. It's 11:52, and I am a very, very hard-working radio presenter. I think sometimes you forget this. Very, very, very hard-working. But I can't come up with a question with which we could examine some of the elements of the Prince Harry story, largely because I'm cognizant of libel law and that all of the allegations, or almost all of the allegations before the court today, are denied. But I do feel that it might be a good day to talk about him and some of the attendant issues. So if you can come up with a way of handling this subject that I am seduced by, the way to get in touch is probably best by text on this one, 84850. Although there is a lovely story that I'm keen to talk about in the next hour as well, so no pressure. Fraser Knight has been in the High Court all morning and joins us now. Fraser, let's start with the atmosphere. He's been in the witness box himself this morning. The first time I think a royal has been in court since Princess Anne got into trouble for her dogs biting somebody in Windsor Great Park a few years ago. What was the atmosphere like, and what was his delivery and tone like?
I have to say, James, he's actually been quite relaxed in that witness box. He's been speaking very softly. Of course, he's been in there for about an hour now, and only just in the past sort of 10-15 minutes does it feel like he's started to warm up. He's speaking a bit more confidently. He's pushing back against the lawyer that's representing Mirror Group newspapers, and he's also even cracked a joke about feeling like he's being put through a workout with the numbers of bundles of paper that he's been asked to refer to. But yeah, sitting quite relaxed in that witness box. When we all walked into the courtroom this morning, the bench is full, not only with journalists but with members of the public as well. He was sat just behind his lawyers, and you could see that he was sort of leaning backwards, ready to have his say. But yeah, starting to get into it now. I think that he's been in there for about an hour now.
And I mean, we've got a fair idea of what he said because the witness statements have been out there. Did any of his testimony prompt sharp intakes of breath in the courtroom or anything like that?
So I think some of the bombshell evidence that we were told we might be able to expect has come in that witness statement. I mean, just sort of reading through it while he was giving his evidence in the courtroom, he hits out at various elements of the tabloid media, talking about them trying to shape members of the royal family, especially, he says, when you're a spare to the heir, into the narrative that tabloid media wants them to be in. And he talks about sort of living up to some of those headlines he felt when he was in his teens and his 20s, committing the crimes he said that he was being accused of already. But also in there, James, hitting out at Piers Morgan, of course, the former editor of the Daily Mirror, over the period that these allegations relate to, saying that he and Meghan have been, his wife Meghan, the Duchess of Sussex, have been subject to a barrage of intimidation, he says, by him. Of course, Piers Morgan's always denied any knowledge of any illegal tactics being used to gather information, but also a hit out at the government in that witness statement as well, James. He talks about there needing to be proper press regulation, and in his words, he says the current government clearly has no want for that. He says because their friends in the press say so. So, in terms of what he said in the court, though, it's been sort of going through his own experiences. Nothing too shocking just now. The lawyer trying to break down that timeline and question those allegations.
And do we have, speaking of timelines, do we have much inkling of how things progress from here? Because he's far from the only witness. He's far from the only person bringing this case. Do we have an idea of how long things are likely to take and when conclusions could be expected?
So Prince Harry is one of 4 big names that are being used as sort of test cases for around 90 claimants in this huge case against the Mirror Group newspapers, James. He is in the witness box today, and tomorrow we expect that cross-examination from MGN Mirror Group newspapers to go through today and into tomorrow. And then there are further witnesses. This is a 7-week trial in total.
7.
It's already been going on for 2 weeks or so, kind of looking at generic arguments, but yet more witnesses to come in the weeks ahead.
And his mood? Final question. I know these are slightly sort of daytime television. I'll be making a personal statement next, Fraser. But, this is his moment. He's been waiting. I sound like Martine McCutcheon now. He's been waiting a very long time for this moment. And
he has.
And is there a sense that he is aware of its profundity?
I think the fact he's even in the witness box, James, tells us just how much he wants his voice to be heard here. When he arrived in the Range Rover this morning, there was huge crowds, and he kind of looked around. I don't think he waved, but he sort of looked around at everyone. And when he's in that witness box, like I say, starting to warm up, starting to hit back at some of those questions that are being put to him by the lawyers in there. But still, as it stands just now, seeming relaxed. Of course, we've still got the rest of today and tomorrow morning to go as well. So we'll see just what more comes out from him and how that mood might change.
Well, you better get back inside. Don't fall out with the judge, whatever you do, Fraser Knight, because we need your reports regularly throughout the day and indeed possibly much of the ensuing 7 weeks live on LBC. Fraser Knight there with you live from the High Court. You can read the witness statement. It's 55 pages long if you're wondering why I haven't shared more of it with you. But here's another excerpt. My voicemails would include incredibly private and sensitive information about my relationships, my operational security and that of my family, my work, both in the army and as a senior member of the royal family, and also any plans that I had made for my time off, including holidays and downtime with friends. They would also include incredibly private and sensitive information about those with whom I associated with. I remember on multiple occasions hearing a voicemail for the first time that wasn't new, but I don't remember thinking that it was particularly unusual. So you'll be familiar with your own voicemail, right? You only hear your message is flagged as new, but then you carry on listening to your voicemail after you've listened to the new message. We don't use it anything like as much as we used to anymore because of all the other stuff, isn't it? It's all WhatsApp and this, that and the other. How old did I just sound? But then you'd listen to all your stored voice messages as well. So he'd log on to his voicemail and he'd listen to his stored messages and think, I haven't heard that one before. But he just would, as he says himself, I would simply put it down to perhaps a technical glitch, as mobile phones were still relatively new back then, or even just having too many drinks the night before and having forgotten that I'd listened to it. We've all been there. And I stress again that Mirror Group newspapers denies most of the claims that are being brought. But again, apologies to Katrina and Sean. We'll take your calls after the news because I want to tell you something else that's relevant to this story, or to phone hacking in general. I've been writing about it for my new book, in part, mostly about Leveson, touching a little bit upon hacking. Andy Coulson's arrival in Downing Street shortly after resigning from the News of the World in relative or associated disgrace, and then going to prison, coming out of prison and being hired by the Daily Telegraph to provide advice on reputational enhancement. I'm not making this up. I should stop giving you all the juice. It's all out there. It's just not in the same place. Touch wood before, unless someone gets published first. But one victim of phone hacking blamed a family member, blamed a sister for a really intimate story getting into the newspapers because her sister was the only person that she'd told. And it never crossed her mind that exchanges on voicemail between her and her sister had been listened to by investigators working for newspapers or by newspaper journalists. Just have a think about that for a minute. Your sister is the only person that knows you are, let's say, pregnant. Right? The only person you've told is your sister. And it turns up in a newspaper the next day. So what do you do? Who do you blame? She's the only person you've told. So you check. I mean, did you tell anyone? No, I promise. I swear. Of course I didn't tell anyone. You must have told someone. How's it got into the paper? Think about the damage that could do to a relationship. And now, particularly if you're someone who spends a lot of time on social media attacking Prince Harry and his wife, now just think about the possibility, or the allegation, not even the fact, just the possibility that he has spent his entire life at constant risk of that sort of betrayal of trust, or perceived betrayal of trust, his entire life. That's what this case is about. And don't let anybody tell you otherwise. It is 5 minutes after 12 and you're listening to James O'Brien on LBC. I mean, it is absolutely astonishing, this witness statement and the testimony now being given, the cross-examination now underway in the High Court, as Fraser Knight just made us aware. And I speak as someone who knew most of it already, or at least suspected most of it already. The sheer scale of it is almost unbelievable. And of course, he's brought receipts to court as well. The reason why many of these... Is the word plaintiff? Is that the right word? Are they plaintiffs? The reason why many of these people bringing these cases are able to do so is that they have had access, or they have been made aware of documentation that appears to support their suspicions and support their allegations. Things like records of financial payments and what have you. And I've seen a couple myself, but I probably shouldn't say any more than that. Not relevant to this case, but the names of the executives and editorial staff who have signed off on things can be seen by some of these people as well. Evan Harris, who we spoke to yesterday, and his team at Hacked Off and elsewhere, doing astonishing work in bringing this. I mean, it's like trying to herd cats. There's so much history. It's a miracle that it gets to court at all. But I don't know what you want to talk about on this. I'll talk to Katrina and Sean shortly about the teaching story. I just haven't at the minute got a way into it that will yield fruitful phone calls. It's a nice phrase. I'm not giving up yet, though. 12:06 is the time. Katrina is in Cardiff. Kids, well, I thought Sam was a wonderful caller. I don't know if you heard her, but the idea that it's not so much the rowdy pupils as what the pupils have been turned into by the system. What did you want to say, Katrina?
Well, I totally agree. I mean, I think I went into teaching in the late 90s. It was a long time ago, obviously. And then I came out of the classroom in 2021, became an education consultant. Okay. So I go to various different schools, and a lot of what I do is to do with behaviour, even though I'm a neurodiversity specialist. Okay. So I'm mainly dealing with children who have additional needs. And there's been loads of things that have happened, but there's this increasing micromanagement, which I think your previous caller talked about, yes, where there's this very prescriptive idea of this kind of monolith of traditional teaching being the way forward, whereas, as has been kind of the theme throughout what your callers have said, this kind of systems of punishment and reward that we traditionally have used in teaching just simply don't work. Mm. They don't work. I mean, there's all kinds of reasons for that, but, since the 2014 SEN Act, there's been much more of a move towards inclusion, which I absolutely embrace. I think it's a brilliant idea. But at the same time, the teachers in the classroom haven't had the relevant training to be able to deal with these children. Okay. So one of the things that I get asked repeatedly is, it's all very well and good what I've got to do with this child, but what am I supposed to do with the other 29 whilst I'm helping him or her? Right. And that can sound incredibly heartless. It's not meant in that way at all. No, didn't strike me, not the way you explained it then. Didn't strike me as heartless at all. No, I mean, I think that our teachers are completely underskilled for dealing with the kind of children that they see in front of them. So where were those children before? Were they in specific units? I mean, obviously, like I said, I've got really the long view here. I was teaching from the late 90s and right the way up until 2021. And there's been a huge number of different changes to the way society works. There's been austerity, there's been the financial crisis, there's been, the pandemic. And all of these things have had an effect on the way children's minds and brains work, and also the way society is. And a lot of more children, because of inclusion, a lot of special schools don't have places. It's more difficult to get your child into special school than it is to get them into grammar school.
So why? Well, I mean, and so I mean, I'm playing the long game here as well. So the not distraction, that's an unfair word, but the attention that is dedicated to special educational needs children undermines the teacher's ability to control a classroom and to give the attention.
It shouldn't do, but they feel, what they tell me is they feel de-skilled. I mean, this is what I mean. Like, I provide training to teachers. That's my job.
Yes, of course.
So obviously they're coming to me for help. You know, I do a lot of work with exclusion prevention. I do a lot of work with anxious non-attenders, and as you know, those are two huge, massive problems. I mean, the ridiculous number of children we've got hundreds of thousands of children. That's no exaggeration, out of school on a daily basis.
I know.
And if you look at the statistics of that, if a child has SEND, they are 6 times more likely to get excluded from school than their neurotypical
Okay,
peers.
so this is probably an overlooked part of this research then, and teachers would be reluctant to put it in the terms that you've put it in because it does, as you say, run the risk of making them sound unkind.
Yeah, and they're not. The thing is, they want to help every single child, but they just look at this child in front of them and don't know what on earth to do. It is funding. It's funding, but also the PGCE that I did, which was, 23, 24 years ago, we had half a day on SEND, right? My partner, who graduated in 2021, also had half a day on SEND. So things haven't moved forward in terms of that. And it's not enough. And also, it's what you get zero behaviour.
And historically, we had children leaving school who'd been essentially excluded from the system, even if they were still sitting in classrooms. They were leaving without any ability to read or write. People who've got what we would now recognise as special educational needs, who've lived lives in slow motion almost, because they just opted out of school at a very early age, and it suited the teachers to let them. Whereas really what we should be doing is reaching every corner of the classroom.
Yeah, absolutely. But we don't have... The thing is, actually, you don't need a huge amount of resources if you have properly trained staff. But
no, I just want to clarify that, because you've upset Annette when you use the word underskilled. She thinks you're having a crack at the staff, but you're doing the opposite of that. You're saying that they need more. They need more help.
I mean de-skilled. Yes. What I mean by that is de-skilled insofar as you can see the child in front of you. You've got your PGCE.
Yes.
You've got
you haven't got the skills you need to help that child.
You haven't got the skills you have to. You haven't been. I mean, there was just
and you haven't got anyone else in the classroom that can do it.
No,
instead,
you might have a TA if you're lucky. If you're lucky, you might get a TA, but they're getting made redundant in a ridiculous level.
Yeah.
I mean, there was a survey done the other day by the National Autistic Society, and it said only 14% of teachers had adequate training in autism. Yeah. And yet, if you consider the level, so autism is approximately 1 in 28 of the population. So every class is going to have an autistic child. The vast majority of those are just going to get through masking and through having relative intelligence to be able to pretend that they're okay. But those who struggle really, really struggle, and that is completely de-skilling for the teachers. So it's not the teacher's fault that they don't know what to do. It's just that
that's what you mean. Of course, and I'm glad you've clarified that phrase. And again, I mean, listen, I'm not criticising the newspaper for once. I think that they have to chop it up into manageable chunks, but the headline is particularly unhelpful. Rowdy pupils driving out teachers. There will be rowdy pupils. There will be problems with aggression and apathy, and there will be a decline in respect for teachers, but it will not be as simple as the students being revolting. There will be all sorts of things going on, and teachers really not getting the help that they need, which is why our friend in Great Yarmouth began by pointing out how quickly certain elements of the media and the political class will jump upon teachers. I never tire of pointing this out to you. They turn on firefighters, junior doctors, nurses, teachers. These are people who do what I do for a living, one of the easiest jobs in the world. It's just bullying, isn't it? I mean, it's just appalling bullying. Lazy tabloid bullying. And what teachers really need is to be listened to and helped. But no, here along comes a backbencher to claim that they all swing the lead and take long holidays, and here's a tabloid columnist to claim that they've never had it so good. It's just pointless, absolutely pointless. And who suffers? The children. So who's really damaging the children's prospects? The adults in my profession and politics insisting that you ignore the teachers, especially when they go on strike. That's when you've really got to ignore them. Sean's in Greenwich. Last word on this, Sean. What do you want to say?
Hi there. I quit teaching a couple of years back. Started in 2004. Absolutely loved it to start off with. Always worked in inner city schools. Ended up teaching in TRUs, pupil referral units, for the kids go where they're expelled. I taught
permanently excluded.
Yeah, permanently excluded. Ended up taught in northwest London, very gang affiliated areas. So I was really in the heartland of what the kind of kids. They are the result of all these problems. It's not that they are the problem; they are the result of all their problems. And there's just so many factors that go towards that. I mean, the lady a couple of calls before, modern day teaching drives me wild in terms of the kids are boiled down to a statistic. Excel spreadsheets and statistics run the average school. That's what it's governed on, and that's what it's judged on. Also, there's a lot of internal politics in any one school, and I bet the amount of teachers would agree with me that the wrong people are being promoted in so many schools.
Yeah, I'm not that interested in that angle, because that always sounds a little bit like a personal grievance about your own lack of promotion. I'm not saying it is in your case, but we can't really make prescriptive plans on something as vague as saying we need to promote better people, for example, me. By the time they get to the PRU, it seems to me, from what you're portraying, that there's not a lot you can do. So there's nothing that could change in the PRU that would make you more effective at what you do, because by the time they get there, the damage, for want of a better word, has already been done.
Yeah, most definitely. And it might be a bit of an unpopular comment, but I can only judge on what I saw.
Yes, of course.
Was that the lack, and I'm not going to say parents in here, the lack of father figures.
Right.
That is something that is really.
So how would you
prevalent.
fix that, Sean?
Again, Dave, sit people down and give them a good finger wagging. No, I'm joking.
Well, I'm not. I just wonder how you'd fix that, because, as we say, we're looking for sort of helpful suggestions for improvement. So if someone lacks a father figure and you think that's why they've got discipline problems with their behaviour, how would you fix that?
Well, I think a lot more. It's this one-size-fits-all thing of education.
We're specifically addressing the absence of a father figure. How would we fix that?
Well, you'd need tailoring for individual pupils, not treating that pupil as an individual. So maybe have them doing certain schemes at the weekend, after school clubs, where they can have a bond with one or two teachers in that environment. Where they
won't turn up, will they?
Oh, no, I would. No, if they get to like that, I'm not saying come to mass clubs after schools. It could be a football club. It could be a rugby club. It could be a boxing club. Something that child will engage with. And I'd done it at one of the schools I was at. And certainly you had some of the more, inverted commas, troublesome children turning up, and they absolutely loved it. And some of them are young men now still doing that. So
you're talking about purpose. I think the phrase father figure is unhelpful, really, isn't it? I mean, you're talking about purpose in life, or a sense of stuff going on, or male role models, not fathers.
Yeah. Well, no, I've got a stepson. He's not, so it's kind of different in a way. But I'm not saying you have to be biologically paired to that person,
right.
But definitely some form of role model. And I'm just drawing a parallel with the students I dealt with.
Yeah.
That was a really common thread. You couldn't ignore that, because it would be and it would put a lot of weight on the other parent, and they would obviously, if they imagine them getting dragged into school because what a child's being, I use the word naughty. I know it's a very unfashioned word to use, but they're being naughty, or there's behaviour.
It's probably the best word available. And what do you do now?
I work in the TV and film industry.
Oh, okay. Are you still doing the work with the sort of father figure stuff at weekends?
Unfortunately not.
That's a shame. It's 18 after 12. It is 20 minutes after 12, and you are listening to James O'Brien on LBC, where we turn our attention next, although at this point in proceedings I'm not 100% clear on how, to the unfolding and frankly astonishing, even for those of us paid to pay attention to these matters, events in the High Court this morning. The cross-examination of Prince Harry continues. The witness statement, all 55 pages of it, continues to be poured over. Among the things that I already knew but had forgotten, just by way of an aside, Simon Case, the Cabinet Secretary, back in the firing line again this morning, of course. Partygate, not the decorations. I don't think he was in post for the decorations of the Downing Street flat. I'd need to double check, but he was there for the parties, of course, and the bank, the loan guarantee that was facilitated by the bloke that Johnson then put in charge of the BBC. He has a link to the royal story as well. Would you believe it? He has a link to the... he was private secretary to Prince William after he was a Brexit negotiator. It's like this guy was made by committee to get up my nose. He's on the Brexit negotiating team. Then he went to work for Prince William, where he apparently earned the ire of Prince Harry, who describes him as the fly in his book and says he'd spent much of his career adjacent to, and indeed drawn to, poo. That's not the word Prince Harry uses in the book. The offal of government and media and wormy entrails. He loved it. He grew fat on it. He rubbed his hands in glee over it, which is probably why Boris Johnson hired him, given that few people in British politics have ever produced more of that substance than Boris Johnson. Westminster is rife with speculation that he is referring to Case. He has unsavoury nicknames for 3 senior royal courtiers, and the clever money is that the fly referred to Simon Case, who then, of course, went from being Prince William's private secretary into Boris Johnson's private office, subsequently cabinet secretary. So I could sit here now until Sheila gets here, just reading you stuff and commenting on it. I really could. And I wonder whether I should have done that. I should have prepared you for it a bit better, because it's so of a piece with so many of my own passions and intrigues and concerns. How about this? My view is how anybody can how can anybody possibly trust a media organisation that enjoys the liberties of free press when their own legal people and board covers up the truth? When they have the powers that they have, and where even the police and the government are scared to hold them accountable or seek justice against them. They can truly believe they are above the law. And if they're above the law, then it's the general public that suffer. It's really that simple. Gosh, it does make you feel completely helpless and hopeless. And if that's how it feels to someone in my position, here it is. So I'm reading this cold, by the way. That's it there. That's the point I've tried to explain to you on a million different occasions. Why do they go after him with such viciousness? And his wife with such viciousness. 2 key players in the Murdoch empire, Piers Morgan, Jeremy Clarkson, almost competing to be the vilest imaginable man with relation to that young woman in particular. And that's why. That's why. If that's how it feels to someone in my position, having grown up with advisors and secretaries to try and manage press relations, I can only imagine what that feels like for everybody else. John Alford, do you remember him? Used to be in London's Burning. Got turned over by a tabloid newspaper, and they told him that they had some big contract for him, or some big career opportunity, a real massive payday, and they were all celebrating, and someone said to him, could you get us a bit of cocaine, do you think, because you're a bit showbiz? So he made a phone call and he ended up in jail. He ended up in prison. Hey, look, cocaine is illegal, don't do drugs. But my goodness me, talk about entrapment. And this, of course, is why Harry refers to having all of the advisors, all of the say. Why do they go after him so violently? Because he is in a position to push back. No one ever has before in the royal family. But that's why he's there. If I had known this cover-up, he says, was going on back in the day, I would have been disgusted and would have tried to seek some kind of justice, although I suspect I wouldn't have got very far. However, having experienced what I have over the last 6 years in terms of the constant harassment, online and off, intimidation and abuse that my wife and I have suffered at the hands of the tabloids, this sort of appalling behaviour doesn't really surprise me. And then he says the thing that really, really boils their proverbial. He says, without proper press regulation, which the current government clearly have no appetite for because their friends in the press said so, it's only going to get worse. And there are pages and pages and pages of this. I'll read you a paragraph that I found particularly pertinent. In my view, in order to save journalism as a profession, journalists need to expose those people in the media that have stolen or hijacked the privileges and powers of the press and have used illegal or unlawful means for their own gain and agendas. In the same vein, I am bringing this claim, not because I hate the tabloid press or even necessarily a section of it, but in order to properly hold the people who have hijacked those privileges, which come with being a member of the press, to account for their actions. And he talks about his unique perspective and experience, perhaps, having had a front row seat to it. And then that line again about, of course, Piers Morgan, who remains very much in a position of prominence within Rupert Murdoch's empire. Unfortunately, as a consequence of my bringing my Mirror Group claim, both myself and my wife have been subjected to a barrage of horrific personal attacks and intimidation from Piers Morgan, who was the editor of the Daily Mirror between 1995 and 2004, presumably in retaliation and in the hope that I will back down before being able to hold him properly accountable for his unlawful activity towards both me and my mother during his editorship. Of course, Mirror Group newspaper deny most of the accusations being levelled against them and claim that some of the others have been sitting idly too long to be considered in the court. And Piers Morgan recently explained that he wouldn't be taking any lessons in the invasion of privacy from Prince Harry. 12:27 is the time. The problem is this. I've already explained it to you in part, but I'll explain it to you again. Apart from The Guardian and possibly the Financial Times, where are you going to read this tomorrow? Where are you going to hear this tomorrow? What about the Express, James? They haven't. No, it's owned by the same company as the Mirror now. Didn't used to be when this stuff allegedly happened, but it is now. So you've got 3 cases coming forward, all similar, all denied, involving the 3 biggest newspaper companies in the country. And there's nothing left after that, except the one, of course, that's owned by the son of the KGB agent who's being sanctioned in Ukraine. The agent has been sanctioned in Ukraine. The son hasn't. The son was put in the House of Lords by Boris Johnson after he was advised not to by the security services. So where are you going to read this stuff tomorrow? Where are you going to hear it? Who are you going to trust? Look what they've done to The Guardian. Not my favourite paper, I'll be honest with you. They're tearing each other apart over transgender issues and Jeremy Corbyn. I almost forget what a unique role they hold in the British media, it seems to me sometimes, over at The Guardian and The Observer. But where are you going to get this stuff tomorrow? Where's it going to be? Who's going to give you honest coverage of this incredibly important story? Where are you going to get it? Are you going to get it in the Express? No, that's owned by Mirror Group. Are you going to get it in the Mail? No, that's owned by DMGT. They've got a court case coming down the pipeline as well. You're going to get it in the Sun? No, because same empire as the News of the World, which was the dam that broke first, and they've got all manner of problems facing them. Already made loads of payouts, as have the Mirror Group, without admitting any wrongdoing for the reasons that I explained to you yesterday, known as a Part 36 quite often. So you're not going to get it in the Express, you're not going to get it in the Mirror, you're not going to get it in the Sun, you're not going to get it in the Times, you're not going to get it in the Sunday Times or the Sun on Sunday or the Sunday Express or the Sunday Mirror or the Sunday People. Telegraph? Good luck with that. Guardian, I can't trust a thing you read in The Guardian. Bloody lefties. The Eye, I forget how the breakdown works between the Lebedevs and the Daily Mail, but it's unlikely. There are good journalists on all of these papers. Let me be absolutely clear about that. But if you think Prince Harry's getting a bit carried away when he talks about the threat to journalism, not a threat, the damage already done to journalism, then just ask yourself that question. Where am I going to read this tomorrow? Luckily, I'll be here. It's 12:30. You're listening to James O'Brien on LBC. Amelia Cox is here now with your headlines. It is 12:33. Numerous newspapers had reported a rumour that my biological father was James Hewitt. I'm reading Prince Harry's witness statement now, not making a remarkable revelation live on the radio, although I am adopted. So, numerous newspapers had reported a rumour that my biological father was James Hewitt, a man my mother had a relationship with after I was born, Harry said. At the time of this article and others similar to it, I wasn't actually aware that my mother hadn't met Major Hewitt until after I was born. So this is referring to an article in 2002 with the headline, Plot to Rob the DNA of Harry, reportedly as part of a bid to steal a sample of the Duke's DNA to check his parentage. This followed newspaper stories reporting rumours that his father were aimed at ousting him from the royal family, stories about his parentage. Nonsense, obviously, but he learnt in 2014 about the actual timeline, but that wouldn't have been common knowledge among the defendant's journalists. So 12:35 is the time. It's too early for people to start feeling silly, and this is only a very small corner of the UK media. And even if his case is not successful, so a lot of the stuff that's coming out in court is proven already. It's just whether or not You know how the law works. The stories that he refers to were published. So even if the way those stories were obtained doesn't deliver the verdict that Prince Harry is hoping for, it is the simple fact that those stories were published at all that would, in a civilized society, prompt a serious review of consciences. I don't know that you're going to get it much in the media, but among the general public, among the people on social media and Twitter who have exposed these two people to all manner of horrific abuse and continue to do so. I mean, stuff that, beggars belief. Even as someone who every month or so goes and have a look at what the anti-vax lot and the World Economic Forum are saying and comes away 52% laughing my socks off and 48% absolutely chilled to the core. Even as someone who looks at that bilge, the stuff that Harry and his wife put up with is off the charts. Julian Suffolk reminds us, of course, that he was a child throughout much of this. And I'm going to read all 55 pages of it. I've got a horrible feeling I'm going to have to rewrite half a chapter of my new book as a consequence of some of the stuff that's come out. But I think I return now, knowing what you know, simply the stuff that I have shared with you so far and more that I will share with you between now and 1 o'clock. I want you to tell me this, and I'll take any answer you've got. Well, I won't, actually. It has to make sense and be good. Why do you think, I'm wondering if this is rhetorical. Why do you think the newspaper industry hates Prince Harry so much? 0345 6060 973. Given that this case has been in gestation now for a number of years, why do you think the newspaper industry despises Prince Harry and his wife? Hit the numbers now, you will get through. 0345 6060 973. And if you're ready to do it, tell me why you do. Why do you despise them so? Why do you think you do? Or ideally, why you did? But it's the newspaper industry first. Why now? Do you see? Do you get it now? I could literally pick up stuff there about his parentage, reading about lies about his mother, lies about his parentage. Everywhere you turn, there is stuff about his relationship with Chelsea Davy. Crikey, the stuff is it's almost unstoppable. It's like an avalanche of evidence. The paparazzi, the infringements of security, people knowing where he was going to be when he hadn't told anybody except his closest friends. Everywhere you turn, it's absolutely astonishing. And the question now becomes, why do you think the newspaper industry despises Prince Harry so much? In fact, I'd go a little bit further. Why do you think the newspaper industry is so desperate to hurt Prince Harry? 0345 6060 973. And I'm particularly interested in hearing from you if you've got an answer to that question that is a little bit different from what it would have been yesterday. But I'll take any answer you've got. Why do you think the newspaper industry in this country, and remember its tentacles extend into almost every corner of the broadcast media as well, up to, sadly, and including the BBC, who are so frightened of the newspapers that they often struggle to remember what day it is. Why do you think the newspaper industry are so desperate to hurt Prince Harry and his wife, to the point where he has said in his witness statement they're desperate to break up his marriage? Why do you think, because you matter, you're the reader, potentially, you're the punter, you're the consumer, you're the audience. Why do you think all of the biggest names in the British media, with a couple of glorious exceptions, why do you think all of the biggest names in the British media are so desperate to break this couple up and to hurt them, to physically, I tell you what, to viscerally, it's one of Jeremy Clarkson's favourite words, to viscerally hurt them? Why? 0345 6060 973. And that leads me inevitably to the second part of this inquiry, which if we haven't got time to do it properly today, we'll do it again tomorrow. Here it is. Ready? What's he done wrong? What's he really done wrong? 0345 6060 973. Janice in Leytonstone. Jana, what do you reckon?
I think that he's disrupted their profit model.
I think that the newspapers had this great model of a narrative they could spin that was almost universal. If you compare it to the 7 stories that writers talk about, they had the villains and the wastrels in the terms of the Sussexes. They had the Wales set up as the good guys, the obedient son, the virtuous wife. They disrupted that model because they simply took themselves out of the narrative.
They refused to play their part in the pantomime, in the parts written for them by the powerful institutions that he's now battling in court.
That is exactly it. Not only that, but he also disarmed them in terms of even if he stepped out of that narrative, he should have been a walking, talking gold mine of gossip. But by
he kind of still is.
Book,
I mean, but not the walking, talking gold mine they wanted him to be.
Yes, exactly. Because also by virtue of his book and the various interviews they've done, and also the fact that they've maintained very strongly that if you hear friends, this, that, and the other, it's not from us. If we want to say anything to you, we will deliver it ourselves. So they have become the arbiter of their own news, the arbiter of their own gossip, and they have, as a result, they've just nullified this. His book had some stories and details in it, which didn't exactly always put him in a good light.
No.
But he put everything out there.
That's quite a therapy thing,
nobody else would be able to weaponize it against him.
Well, that's part of it. Also, I think therapeutically he needed to. I think that's part of the therapeutic process. But it robs any potential enemy of. It won't stop them from doing so. So you can say, I can't believe he told all that stuff about losing his virginity. But it's a weird accusation to use something that somebody told you to come back and try and hurt them with it. It is. Yeah. I mean, there it is. And the. Yeah,
I mean, he's how old? He's not quite 40.
Is he not?
He's not quite 40, so there should have been a good 20 more years, and then his children would have been on the block. You know, his children,
Here's a weird question.
His mixed-race children would have been the next target. He's playing the long game.
Just refusing to do it.
This is really difficult for the past 2 years, for the next coming 2 or 3 years, but as far as he's concerned, this is about the rest of his life, and this is about the rest of his children's life. And this actually, I have to say, I think it's probably also about his nieces and nephews' lives.
I was about to ask you that. I was about to ask whether it makes you feel sorry for other members of the royal family who...
Oh, absolutely.
It does.
Absolutely. Gosh. You can already see that all of the focus on the little prince that belongs to the Sussexes, I can't remember his name now, but
George.
all of this stuff about him monkeying around.
Louis.
He's 4 or 5. He's monkeying around. He's getting overtired. He's expected to do something that an average 4 or 5-year-old is not capable of doing and isn't asked to do. And they're painting a narrative. And they're also slotting the little princess, whose name escapes me as well. They're slotting her into a narrative.
And he will be. I think you're right. I don't think
he'd.
I mean, he'd get absolutely crucified if he said that out loud. Or I mean, he may have alluded to it, but I mean, imagine how upset their own parents would be if the public perception that he was protecting their children from enemies they weren't prepared to fight was to gain traction. I mean, no wonder there's no love lost there. Thank you, Jana. Liam's in Clapham. He says, it's power, James. They want to show everyone that if they can defeat him, they can defeat anyone. Puts the fear of God into everyone else. They're bullies. It's the last swings of a dying print industry. I was reading something that Miriam Gonzalez, I forget her, Miriam Sanchez Gonzalez, Nick Clegg's wife, international trade lawyer, doughty campaigner for women's rights. I was reading something she wrote about her treatment at the hand of the print media when her husband became deputy prime minister. It was almost word for word what Liam said. They just wanted to remind me what damage they could do to my family if he stepped out of line. Phil's in chat. Actually, I'm a bit late. We'll come to Phil first after the next break. Just every page that I turn over. Sheila's returning to this subject shortly, and she's had a little bit longer to process some of this information. But tying in with what Jana said, here's more from the witness statement. You're then either the Playboy prince, the failure, the dropout, or in my case, the thicko, the cheat, the underage drinker, the irresponsible drug taker. The list goes on. As a teenager and in my early 20s, I ended up feeling as though I was playing up to a lot of the headlines and stereotypes they wanted to pin on me, mainly because I thought that if they are printing this rubbish about me and people were believing it, I may as well do the crime, so to speak. It was a downward spiral whereby the tabloids would constantly try and coax me, a damaged young man, into doing something stupid that would make a good story and sell lots of papers. Looking back on it now, such behaviour on their part is utterly vile. I have got two thoughts, which I've had before and I'll have again, but my God, this lad has both had some fantastic therapy and fallen in love with a magnificent woman. And if anybody deserves it, it's him. 12:48 is the time. It's a bit mad, this. It's a slow news week in many ways, in terms of thinking of things that we can talk about together. I know I shouldn't bore you with the tiny travails of my professional existence, but it is a bit tricky sometimes to know what's going to be interesting, what isn't, and to stumble across stories that you'd missed previously about rowdy pupils driving out teachers or degrees being worthless. And yet there are 2 or 3 massive stories simultaneously unfolding as well. The first being the COVID inquiry getting underway today in Paddington. We'll catch up with Henry Riley shortly about events there while we've been on air. The second is the Prince Harry court case against Mirror Group newspapers, which has seen the publication of a frankly breathtaking witness statement, even for those of us who thought that we were across the facts. It is seeing it all in one place that is so breathtaking. And of course the clarification that the appointment of Sue Gray to work for Keir Starmer was completely above board and absolutely no problem at all. Now, the question of coverage fascinates me. I can't go on about it endlessly, but do you think that the fact that Sue Gray's appointment to the Labour Party has been found by the watchdog to be completely kosher, just like the curry in Durham? You remember that? 12 Daily Mail front pages, and it was all completely kosher. Do you think the fact that there was no fire or smoke will get the same coverage as the claims that there were loads of fire and smoke? So I'd see the curry gate and I'd raise you Sue Gray. I said at the time this will be another curry gate. I tried to warn these guys, these client journalists. I said to them, it's going to happen again. It's going to happen again. You've gone all in on the curry and now you're going all in on Sue Gray. But it doesn't matter because, of course, they work within the environment that Prince Harry is describing in the witness box today. There are no consequences. Daily Telegraph's not going to face any consequences for that absolutely nonsensical front page yesterday, lifted verbatim, practically from a book published by the secretly funded Institute of Economic Affairs that is widely regarded as being responsible for Liz Truss and Kwasi Kwarteng's economic policies. Doesn't matter. But there it is, 3 things unfolding simultaneously. We will turn our attention next to the COVID inquiry in Paddington, where LBC's Henry Riley has been keeping eyes and ears on proceedings. Henry, what can you tell us?
James, today mostly housekeeping from the COVID inquiry, looking into those political decisions made by the government. But essentially, what we were waiting with bated breath to find out what Baroness Hallett had to say about WhatsApp Gate. And the retired judge, she addressed it square on. She said, as has been reported in the media, an issue did arise between the inquiry and the Cabinet Office as to who decides what is relevant. She then confirms that actually the Cabinet Office asked her to withdraw her Section 21 notice. That would compel those documents to be handed over. And she declined to do so. But what did we learn that was new, James? Well, if your class at school was naughty and the teacher was angry at the whole class, that was a little like how the counsel to the inquiry came across today, Hugo Keith KC. We now learn there is a new government department in the dock. It is the Foreign Office. Mr. Keith saying, we have very recently identified that the Cabinet Office is not alone. The Foreign Office has supplied to the inquiry potentially relevant WhatsApps from 2 special advisors, but you guessed it, James, they are with extensive redactions. Now, you may think, well, this is how the government are going to approach the whole inquiry. Why is it surprising that another department has taken the same approach as the Cabinet Office? That is because, as the KC involved, Mr. Keith references, the Department of Health and Social Care have taken a completely different approach. Instead, they have provided all of the communications unredacted. Matt Hancock, in particular, got a special mention for handing over all of his communications unredacted, although we were aware of a lot of those WhatsApps beforehand.
Hang on, he'd already given them to that Oakshott woman, mate.
Well, yeah. So the inquiry.
Let's hold off on the gold star for Matt Hancock, Henry, please.
Well, the KC was praising him, but okay. I do take your point, James. But anyway, let's have a listen to what Mr. Keith had to say.
It may be worth pointing out that the Department of Health and Social Care, by contrast, has to date provided much fuller disclosure, including Mr. Hancock's WhatsApp messages, without any redactions at all for relevance being applied to that material. And so we would, of course, invite the Foreign Office and the Cabinet Office to pay close regard to the position adopted by the DHSC.
So, James, we'll have to wait till potentially later this month to find out if, of course, the judicial review goes in favour of the government or the inquiry. There's also another row, James, I'm pleased to report to you. This is regarding a new communications form. It's not Facebook Message, it's not WhatsApp, it's not even text messages. It is Google Spaces. The inquiry have revealed that was a forum for key individuals to communicate during the early stages of the pandemic. The Cabinet Office have been asked to hand over that, and as you guessed it, James, they are supplying it redacted. The COVID inquiry saying they need it unredacted, so we've got yet another row, this time about Google Spaces. Baroness Hallett, of course, says that, whatever happens with the judicial review later this month will hopefully set a precedent on that. Just a few other bits to keep you up to speed with as well, James. I reported last week the notebooks were, quote, absolute chaos, a source told me, with Pritt Sticks newspaper articles and indeed post-it notes falling out.
These are Boris Johnson's notebooks.
These are Boris Johnson's notebooks, and they are currently being checked. They only reached the inquiry yesterday from the Cabinet Office, so it took them that long to actually physically go through them. I was also told they were working night and day, so goodness knows how long that took to properly go through in terms of man hours. And we also learn that there will be an inspection of Mr. Johnson's WhatsApps this week. So quite literally, we may see Lady Hallett, Baroness Hallett, sitting down at a desk with the former Prime Minister Boris Johnson, and then both going through his particular phone together. Now, James, I can hear you asking, well, what about the old phone, pre-2021? Well, yet more fun and games with that. We now learn that particular phone, the inquiry can't open safely, and Mr. Johnson can't open safely. So there could be yet another delay, because they've handed over to a specialist within government who is going to try and access the messages on that particular phone. Lastly, as well, they referenced some of the ministers who were going to be called to make written submissions for evidence. A bit of shade thrown by the KC. He said the former Prime Minister Boris Johnson and Liz Truss, the MP, so he didn't even refer to her as a former Prime Minister. Perhaps I'm reading a bit too much into that, but nonetheless a frustrated inquiry, and it's only one of the first preliminary hearings, James.
Just to be clear, Henry, great work, by the way, I'm very grateful. Just to be clear, June the 30th, we think, for the judicial review, and it's all done and dusted then, is it? We will know for sure what the inquiry will and won't be working with. There's no prospect of more postponements or delays.
Well, that's right. And actually, the KC did address this head on and said, of course, we know the timetable of the inquiry. He said if the judicial review is on or round about the 30th of June, it doesn't matter if it bleeds into early July, there will be no further delay in terms of the inquiry's proceedings. But, of course, the Foreign Office issue addressed by the KC today, does that throw up yet more problems? It's unlikely to, because I suppose the judicial review has set a precedent, but nonetheless, you can bet the government maybe are looking into that as well.
So can I clarify one thing? The government still want to keep Johnson's WhatsApps away from the inquiry, but we think Johnson might turn up with them next week and sit down in public with Baroness Hallett and go through them one by one?
Yeah, so this is what I was wondering as well. There are three different strands to it. On the WhatsApps, because Mr. Johnson now has them, he can sit down with the inquiry and is free to do so. Actually, do you remember there was a report over the weekend, James, that the Cabinet Office may withdraw the sort of legal funding for Boris Johnson?
Yes.
That was addressed by the KC involved, and he said he sought clarification from the Cabinet Office. That is not the case. It would only be withdrawn if Boris Johnson gave away messages of national security, not if it was, quote, irrelevant material. Now, the other two issues are the ministerial diaries, official. They are the property of the government. They've been handed over in a redacted form. Boris Johnson actually doesn't own them. They are the property of the government. But those sort of chaotic diaries, which are Boris Johnson's, he can physically... Well, actually, there is a problem there as well, because they were given over to the inquiry. They now need to be handed back over to Boris Johnson, unredacted by the Cabinet Office, so they can go through them. So there's sort of three different components to this, James.
Do you feel, Henry, that it is going to get underway with all of the evidence that Baroness Hallett wants, or do you feel that we may be having another slightly surreal conversation in the next couple of weeks about post-it notes and doodles and Faraday cages and phones that can't be opened because of security fear?
I wouldn't bet against the latter, James. As is often the case with these inquiries, there are often things that arise at the last minute. I mean, the COVID Bereaved Families for Justice, the very influential sort of campaign group, what was striking within the last hour or so, there was a lot of speculation because they were calling for Baroness Hallett, if she doesn't get that material, to actually resign as chair and say, you know, well, they've now confirmed today they will continue to cooperate with the inquiry. They say actually they recognise that Baroness Hallett is desperately trying to get that information. So that's a boost for the inquiry, James. What was a frustrating day.
Quite right as well. And finally, the Foreign Office involvement. I know it's box fresh and no one's had time to process it properly yet, but that may well have something to do with questions about foreign travel at the time with regard to lockdowns. What do you think?
That's right. And, you know, strangely, it relates not to ministers, but in this particular case, the documents they're after are two special advisors. But it could relate to quarantine travel rules. It could relate to the whole issue of hotels, contracts given to hotels. We're not quite sure at this stage, but those are the sort of three things that are in the mix.
OK. Henry Riley, first class stuff. Thank you so much. It's just gone 12:59, which means it's time for me to bid you farewell for another day. With all of those pots bubbling nicely on the hob, I hand over the chef's apron shortly to Sheila. If you missed any of today's show, do you like that analogy, Sheila?
Was that nice? Beautiful.
Aha! If you missed
chef's kiss with my chef's apron.
Listen back on Catch Up on Global Player, where you can, of course, rewind live radio or enjoy the whole show podcast. All of LBC shows to catch up on, as well as the best video clips from LBC and our other global stations. So download that for free from your app store or head to globalplayer.com. Tom, back with you at 4. Sheila Fogarty with you now. 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 Sheila Fogarty with you now.